So, to properly begin our story, we have to turn the clock all the way back to the mid-90s. And Squaresoft has been on one. Over the last couple of years, they'd not only surpassed all expectations with the latest entry in their flagship franchise, but were given the reins on a spin-off title for an even bigger franchise and absolutely nailed it. Meanwhile, they'd also managed to put out a dizzying array of other JRPG classics while somehow managing to set aside time to make the perfect video game while they were at it. But things were primed for a shakeup. This hot new transfer student just joined the class and her storage medium could hold over 10 times the megabytes than any of the other classmates. Square's looking to make the next Final Fantasy the biggest and most immersive yet, so they immediately pony up to Sony, tearing up Nintendo's invitation and getting disinvited from all appearances on their consoles for years to come. This was a huge potential loss for Square, and thus they needed the next Final Fantasy to be a surefire hit. Enter Tetsuya Takahashi, a former graphics designer and scenario writer who had worked on a few of Square's most beloved recent titles. He presented his superiors at the company with a script that told a long, intricate tale set in a world that mixed classic sci-fi dystopia with generations of fantastical lore. A story of lost memories, of altered identities, a story of heartbreak and struggle amidst shifting factions. One full of strange diversions in interesting locales, elaborate one-off sequences, and narrative implications that reach towards the stars themselves, vastly expanding the potential scope of the wider world. A planet in danger. A secret connection to memories of lives long past. Square's higher-ups took one look at this script treatment and said, nah, too dark, too complicated, and thus shelved it in favor of the actual plot of Final Fantasy VII that we've come to know and love, a fun, whimsical, straightforward romp of an archetypal hero's journey. But Square wanted to have just as overwhelming of an output on this new hardware as they did on the Super Nintendo. And as they were very much feeling themselves at the time, they gave Takahashi the go-ahead to develop this strange new script into its own IP. Takahashi and his wife, fellow Square writer and designer Soraya Saga, quickly set to work on what would, decades later, become one of my favorite JRPGs. Hi, I'm Phirmth, and I tend to dig JRPGs. They're a bit of a comfort genre for me. I totally get why people wouldn't enjoy turn-based combat, but it still activates all the right neurons in my gamer brain for a comfy but engaging experience. And while I think random encounters are ultimately indefensible in the grand scheme of things, they personally don't bother me too much. There were a good couple of years where JRPGs were suffering from a bit of a drought, at least in terms of Western releases. Xenoblade Chronicles was hard to get your hands on, and Final Fantasy's most recent non-MMO was, and still is, the series' black sheep. I'd often see discourse about the genre go full nostalgia mode, and in the rare moments when I saw 1998's Xenogears brought up, it was spoken of reverently. It was clear that the game was a cult classic, referred to only in whispers. That name would be brought up, most would respond, fucking what now, and like 3 dudes in the comment section would lose their absolute shit. On top of that, it held some sort of weird, nebulous connection to future games from the same team, a strange meta-franchise that only truly existed in concept. And all this secretive, arcane knowledge came across to me as really fucking cool. I love weird, obscure, cult classic shit, especially when some behind-the-scenes turmoil causes an obvious shift in the final product. Even today, the game is almost entirely off the radar for most fans of the genre, but there's a lot to look back on, especially as this slice of JRPG history that, in an alternate timeline, could have been Final Fantasy VII. If that were the case, it certainly would not have shipped in its current form, but I think that's fascinating. And, even today, it provides a unique experience that anyone who enjoys its contemporaries would appreciate. If you've ever wanted to play Xenogears, if anything you've seen or heard thus far has piqued your interest, you should probably stick this video in your watch later. It'll still be here in a month or 3 when you've finished it, and we can compare notes. It's a cool fucking game that tells a compelling and unique story which executes on it well aside from a few asterisks. Even if you see a twist or two coming, you're gonna have a better time with its plot than you would have if I had spoiled any of it, which, to be entirely clear, I'm about to do in detail. The game makes for a comfortable storybook to read for a few hours before bed each night. It's a playable version of your favorite classic mecha anime, complete with remarkable pacing, an unbelievably dense narrative, a dolphin man named Franz who plays you sound effects, and if you can stomach some combat that looks and feels rad but ultimately melts away into grindy repetition, you'll be rewarded with a story worth remembering, and a long-ass video you can watch if you ever want to revisit it. So yeah, if you want to play this game for yourself, now's the time. Fuck off, away with ye.
Be gone, vile man, be gone from me!
Are they gone? Great. Now it's time to stop pitching you on this game and start talking about motherfucking everything! I don't want to just give you a plot summary, and I definitely don't want to write a review. I want you to get the Xenogears experience. If you can watch this video and fake your way through a conversation about the game with an actual Xenogears fan, then I've done my job. Now, that's a tall order, we're tough to fool, we're goddamn freaks, but I think I put enough effort and mental illness into this video to one-shot this particular cactar. Yes, this video is long. I know that. I'm aware of it. I fucking made it, and it took goddamn forever. CD Color learned how to make and rig VTuber models from the ground up and crafted this Hephaestian masterpiece in the time it's taken me to play through and record this game, write this script, edit and voice over everything myself. I already have 4 more completely unrelated videos. They're already uploaded and scheduled. I just wanted this one to be my first release because I'm fucking deranged. You have no idea how fucking powerful I am.
Blossom, oh fallen seed!
Shut up, you dweeb.
So yeah, haha. Video long. Fuck you. It's a lot less than the 80 hours you would spend playing the game. I wanted to talk about more than this. For me, this is what restraint looks like. Listen, this thing was going to be an epic no matter what if I wanted to go into the level of detail I'm aiming for here. So we're gonna have to just lean into it. You've got that thing you wanted to work on in your other monitor, you got a meal you want to prepare and or eat, you're not gonna spend nearly 4 days worth of time on a game that's only accessible via the PS3 online store or in its physical form for more than $100 because the state of modern games preservation is a fucking late capitalist travesty. You clicked on this, now you're gonna sit your ass down and listen to me hyperfixate for the next 250 plus pages about motherfucking Xenogears.
Xenogears.
Xenogears! Fuck! You know you're in for a good time when a Japanese game quotes Revelations at you. And thus, Xenogears opens, in typical Square fashion, with an FMV cutscene. The CG isn't particularly cutting edge, even for its time, but is supplemented by some nostalgic-feeling 2D hand-drawn anime. A strange ship floats through space as our focus is brought to the chaos on the bridge of this vessel. The ship appears to be under attack, the crew spouting technobabble as they try and fail to stop whatever entity is attacking them.
And its base space logic is being rewritten. Ergo area is increasing. An internal plane is forming.
The ship's fate seems to be sealed when every screen blacks out, covered in a flood of crimson text. One phrase, over and over. You shall be as gods. The captain orders an evacuation of the ship, only for the vessel to turn its own weaponry on the escape pods.
What?
As the ship Tetsuos itself into a nightmare of corrupted machinery, the captain takes one final look at a picture of what one can assume are his wife and daughter, before activating the ship's self-destruct sequence. An eruption of flames and mechanical shrapnel buffeting the planet below. From the wreckage, a purple-haired woman stands, naked like Venus from the foam, and watches solemnly as comets of fragmented machinery rain down upon an ocean horizon. It's a bold opener, but the most interesting thing about this FMV is how it refuses to overtly connect to any of this game's plot for dozens upon dozens of hours. Players might find hints here or there, but there's scarcely an attempt at making the proceedings feel like they're even from the same property. And yet, this sequence is also the game's Attract Mode cutscene, playing anytime you boot up the PlayStation and leave the main menu open for a minute or two. This lets the cutscene haunt the entire playthrough, looming over the player's thoughts. At some point, 50 plus hours into the game, you will inevitably boot up your console and step into the bathroom or run to grab a snack while things load. And when you come back, you'll be greeted by this scene, and you'll think, the fuck does this have to do with anything? I think that does a lot for the player's potential narrative engagement, but like I said, it isn't going to matter for a while, so you can probably just forget about everything I just said for the time being. Much like Xenogears, I'm very good at pacing. With that, Yasunori Mitsuda's god-tier soundtrack kicks in, perfectly underscoring a good old-fashioned expository text crawl. Our first truly relevant piece of world-building is already fairly nuanced and multifaceted. There's a war between the Northern Empire of Kislev and the Southern Desert Kingdom of Aveh, one that's lasted so long no one even remembers the cause. A neutral religious third party known as the Ethos has been unearthing and restoring ancient technologies, and bestowing them upon both sides. Chief among these technologies are humanoid combat mechs, known as gears, ensuring that this game will always have at least one foot in classic mecha anime tropes and its entire dick in war crimes. These gears escalate the scale of the bloodshed, and Kislev begins gaining the upper hand until a new faction known as Gebler arrives, bearing superior technology and lending their assistance to Aveh, bringing things again to a zero-sum. Already, we have 4 separate factions and a central conflict with some real history behind it. As Aveh takes more and more territory, emboldened by its recent gains, we open on the small village of Lahan, on the border between the 2 warring countries. The village is in flames. A man pilots a black gear as another man urges him to take the fight elsewhere. The machine dispatches yet another opponent, its pilot cursing the war as the inferno overtaking the village fills the entire screen. Only to pull back on that same pilot having a nice little Bob Ross of a time. Our protagonist, Fei Fong Wong, decides to take a short break, giving players their first taste of control. Welcome to Xenogears. Immediately of note is the game's art style, a clever blend of 2D sprite work and 3D low-poly environmental design. It's a really effective compromise between the team's ambition and the reality of their skills and budget. The transition into this scene does a perfect job of demonstrating the benefits to this. Having the camera zoom out from the painting and performing a 360 pan of the room would be unthinkable using pre-rendered backgrounds or a fully 2D art style. The team is clearly better at animating 2D sprites than they are 3D models, but changing over the environments like this benefits the game's presentation massively, from perspective tricks to big sweeping camera movements to angles that, again, would simply be impossible in another format. Conventional wisdom would dictate that this would necessarily gut the level of detail the environments have, but no, the dev team clearly put a lot of love into these as well, particularly the indoor areas. Each room is an intricate little diorama full of character and consideration, telling with its arrangement of furniture, the objects littering its surfaces, and the pets tucked away in the corners. It's all very cozy, and the starting village of Lahan is a great place to indulge in it. It's good that there's plenty to investigate here because as the starting village of a JRPG, we already know we're going to be spending a lot of time here. As Fei moves around the village, he gets some admittedly clunky JRPG starting town exposition that quickly catches the player up with his personal situation. The first NPC you can talk to triggers a small flashback of a masked man bringing a wounded Fei to the village in the midst of a rainstorm. Similarly to many other protagonists in the genre, Fei has amnesia and doesn't remember anything before waking up in the village elder's care about 3 years ago. Since then, he's shown his talents for both painting and kung fu, one of which he's taken to teaching the village children. It's kung fu. Fei's teaching the kids kung fu because he's a cool dude. It's a sleepy, peaceful town, and Fei's the most exciting thing to happen in years, but today there's even more cause for celebration as Fei's good friends, Alice and Tim, are going to be married. When you consider how out there the opening cutscene was, and the fairly detailed political situation from the opening crawl, all of this sounds fairly trite and tropey. Fei feels like a real day one Dave of a main character, but that's not necessarily going to stay the case. Amnesia is a tired cliche more than 2 decades later, but this game certainly gets a lot more storytelling bang for its memento buck. Still, this entire opening bit does feel incredibly cliche, even if the familiarity makes for a really effective starting point amidst all the turbulent world building and eventual complex, dense storytelling. I mean, if you've even so much as heard of a JRPG before, you know that the town mortician is about to be booked solid for a month, so it really feels like the game's rubbing it in your face when the groom-to-be Tim tells Fei that they're absolutely going to be friends forever. But you need to set up expectations in order to subvert them, and Xenogears immediately subverts its first expectation by introducing the world's ugliest child, Dan. Dan is a Code Lyoko character transplanted into a Cronenberg movie. Dan is like one of the old kids from Akira, or the old kid from Invader Zim, but like halfway through his young aging process. You could play tic-tac-toe on his forehead and use his concave jawline as a whetstone. Everyone I have seen confronted with this grisly visage has been overtaken with a neurochemical cocktail of shock, laughter, and genuine discomfort.
What do you think of Dan?
Oh, Dan is a shit.
I am aware that I am currently bullying a child. Trust me on this one.
Do you want to expand on that?
Sure. He's, massive and total shit.
Anyway, Dan is the brother of the bride-to-be, and has quite the bone to pick with her
future husband.
He yells a bit at Tim and tells Faye to meet him outside, at which point you have full reign to explore the village. Despite already knowing what's going to happen here, it's a fun and charming place to explore. Mitsuda's soundtrack keeps things lively as you run around, pressing the interact button on barrels to see if they have any items, and on animals to hear their funny little sounds. You can also talk to various NPCs, all while enjoying a fully rotating camera. Hell, you can actually still maintain control of your movement and the camera while talking to most people, something you didn't see much at the time, which feels oddly more immersive. There are lots of fun conversations to be had here. This guy lists a bunch of fun fictional crops, this guy's apparently trans, the village elder fondly remembers his days as a sex pest. You have your obligatory tutorial NPC who tells you all about the game's combat system, which we'll go over later. I think I can explain it far better than this guy based on his spelling of martial arts. There's a lady in the same room who conceptualizes the panning of the camera as turning the world, which is a fun way to think of it. You find your first save point in the corner of this room, or as the game calls it, a memory cube, complete with a sweet sound effect. Next to it is a bespectacled lady in a helmet who's happy to explain how this thing works. The camera zooms in ever so slightly as you are barraged by a massive paragraph of text for roughly 2 seconds before it disappears. She then berates you for not getting all that, explains how to save yet again, calls herself a genius, and takes money from you as compensation for her explanation. If you couldn't tell from her laughter, attitude, and shrewd business sense, yeah, this is Luca from Chrono Trigger in the kind of cameo only she could pull off. Anyways, you can only put off talking to Dan again for so long, and once you do, he gives his grim quest. Marry his sister instead of Tim so that you can be his big brother instead. This is undoubtedly shitty of him, but I can see how someone could maybe interpret this as sweet in a twisted sort of way.
When you first meet him, you think surely to God this man can't be as big a shit as he seems.
Any goodwill you might have built up towards Dan will soon be erased, however, as he begins pitching his sister to Faye, talking specifically about how well endowed she is, and snickering like an unholy fusion dance of both Beavis and Butthead.
That's intriguing. I wonder what's in this book that they saw fit to give it covers made of pure shit. And then you open it and... shit.
You can go and talk to the blushing bride here, who reveals that Faye might have actually had a chance had he gone for the Dennis Reynolds ending. But Faye's far too pure of a dude to come between his friend's marriage, and thus simply offers to pick up the camera equipment from the village doctor's place. And thus we have our first quest, taking us out of the sleepy village of Lahan and into the overworld. The overworld map is really nothing special to speak of. You move around it and rotate the camera just like the rest of the game, and it's pretty barren of points of interest beyond the places you actually need to go to advance the plot. There are forests that give you a few different random encounters, but beyond that it's a serviceable overworld and nothing more. It actually introduces itself fairly poorly here. The only indicator of the path to Satans is this cluster of trees, which can be pretty easy to miss. If you don't see it, you'll end up wandering the area until you quickly realize there's nothing here to do and run into the mountain path by chance. While you're at it, you might happen to familiarize yourself with the game's overzealous encounter rate. Yeah, random battles are far too frequent across the game, and combined with the PS1's slow load times for both battle transitions and opening and closing the menu, can really kill your motivation to explore. While the game's story segments are incredibly compelling, and the battle system has enough quirks and presentational polish to make for a fun spectacle, it gets very grindy very quickly. And with that, I guess we might as well spend a few moments talking about combat. I don't want to spend too long on this for the sake of pacing. We'll talk about more elements as they're introduced, but combat is built off a pretty solid foundation. It's an ATB system akin to Chrono Trigger or countless Final Fantasies before it, but completely pausing everyone's time bar on the player's turn, which makes the experience pretty cozy. You're never rushed to make a decision. The UI is organized very neatly and cleanly, giving quick access to your standard options of attack, defend, escape, use an item, and a combo option that we don't really have access to at this moment. Each character has their own form of magic. Sometimes it's called Ether, sometimes it's called Arcane. In Faye's case, it's called Chi, but they all function similarly and use the character's EP or Ether points. This is frankly a pretty basic bitch combat system, save for the way the attack command works. On the left, you can see Faye's action points, which are consumed by attacking. Characters have light, medium, and heavy attacks executed by the triangle, square, and X buttons respectively. Heavier attacks deal more damage but have lower accuracy and cost more action points, with a heavy attack costing 3. As you level up, you'll gain more action points and thus the ability to pull off longer and more damaging attack sequences. It's a really cool baseline for combat mechanics that is sadly pretty unexplored throughout the game. Some enemies are evasive and better dealt with via light attacks, but not enough to really make you think too hard about the decisions you're making. And not enough enemies have damage thresholds or any other means of encouraging players to take the risk and drop a heavy. Despite this, the system has plenty of benefits, namely that it makes combat look and feel absolutely sick.
Sick, ha! King, ha! Sick!
The sound design and sprite art here pop off unbelievably hard and make every hit landed feel incredibly satisfying. Light and medium attacks have multiple animations each, chaining betwixt them beautifully mid-combo, varying up the visuals even if the effects are mechanically synonymous. The animations show off a ton of character too. Faye maintains his balance expertly through spinning strikes and refined, practiced axe kicks, yet his heavy attack is a raw, angry headbutt. Timing also isn't a factor here. You can wait and think between individual hits, mash them all out at the start of the combo, or time each button press in sequence. This is one instance in which the game doesn't pressure you, but it doesn't waste your time either. The end result goes a shockingly long way towards making regular old combat, or God forbid grinding, a lot more tolerable. Combined with a camera that careens across the battlefield as enemies reposition themselves during and after their attacks, it makes for an extremely cinematic and striking battle system, even if there's disappointingly little under the hood. Like I said, you'll get plenty of opportunities to familiarize yourself with this system during the following mini-dungeon, because Satan, like any good doctor, lives away from the village, across a broken bridge, up a mountain path infested with wolves. There are also these cute little guys who will drain Faye's HP, but they barely deal any damage, and honestly they're really cute and they're called hobgobs, which is even more adorable, so I don't mind their presence. If you defeat them, they even drop hob jerky, a consumable you can use outside of combat to restore HP without using up your potions or aquasol. But like I said, the encounter rate will have these enemies quickly wear out their welcome, despite how short this area ultimately is. There's a brief platforming challenge to introduce you to this game's jumping mechanics. We'll talk about platforming later. And there's a chest that's pretty hard to miss, but that's about it before you get to Satan's peaceful abode. A beautiful camera pan set to some lovely pastoral music introduces us to an idyllic little multi-storied hut, complete with some fun mech wreckage in the backyard. There are plenty of nice little touches here, like the birds you spook as you climb the upper levels of the house, or this chicken that tries to jump scare you. You can say hi to Satan's lovely wife Yui, or his daughter Midori, who silently stares into the abyss of Faye's soul. Yui, who looks incredibly similar to Misa Hayase from SDF Macross, informs Faye that the doctor is out back, tinkering with his junk. So, Faye naturally sets off to catch him in the act. Satan is messing around in the aforementioned wreckage, trying to tune up a mech known as a land crab and causing a small explosion in the process. He brushes it off and tells Faye he has something to show him in the shed below. Faye enters, only to find a mysterious box on a pedestal. Faye is immediately struck by a nostalgia he just can't place, a sensation the soundtrack deftly conveys to the player. Satan enters, monologuing about how music can evoke all sorts of long-forgotten memories. He even goes so far as to suggest, perhaps jokingly, that someone else is living inside of Faye and remembers this song from long ago. Faye does the only reasonable thing one could do in response to this and silently fucks off. After Faye leaves, Satan hints that he knows far more than he's letting on regarding Faye's past. In retrospect, his comments about music and memory almost seem like bait. Suddenly, the music box falls silent, and the angel at its center trembles before shattering. Satan worries out loud that this may indeed be an omen. Before we cut away, with Faye having finished his dinner and preparing to set off. Satan will continue knowing more than he probably should at any given moment, riding the line between an absent-minded genius and someone whose knowledge makes him genuinely suspicious. Faye heads off, only to witness a small squadron of gears head directly to Lahan. Faye and Satan both race to the village, finding the houses in flames and the survivors struggling to flee. Tim and Alice are okay, but some people are trapped and need to be rescued, including Dan. Okay, maybe you don't have to go back for this one. Satan quickly springs into action, evacuating the populace, while Faye surveys the burning town, the game again flexing the camera possibilities its art style and hardware allowed for, while this one lady gets stuck on a piece of geometry. A startling cut to a quick flash of gunfire causes Faye to dive for cover, only to notice a massive, unmanned gear towering above him, calling to him. Brief cuts to what appears to be a young, smiling Faye in the cockpit. An ominous pendulum, crossing the screen hypnotically as it flashes. Surrounded by carnage, Faye gets in the fucking robot. Despite Satan's protests, the game's fantastic gear combat UI activates, with the mech's onboard interface acknowledging Faye's lack of piloting experience and setting itself to easy mode. It's a cute way to integrate a diegetic tutorial that gets itself over with fairly quickly. We won't get too deep into gear combat yet, but for now, suffice it to say it plays very much the same as the on-foot combat and even uses the same basic command ring. Faye's mysterious black gear rocks some pretty sweet kung fu moves and manages to tear through these samurai-looking grunt mechs, despite this being his first time piloting. A cohort of Gundam Wing's Ares suits arrive, flanking an ominous winged gear. As they pepper Faye with their rifles, Satan manages to find who else but Dan, who had fled to safety before, but had then run back into the burning village, not to save his friends and fellow villagers, but to save his sister's wedding dress. Satan drops some more hints that he knows way too much about what's going on when Tim spots them and runs to embrace his soon-to-be brother-in-law. The sudden death of Timothy stuns Faye, and as images flash through his mind, the mysterious gear glows with an awesome power, and Faye rises to take revenge and save the village. 'Cause you had a bad day. Yeah, the entire village is indiscriminately annihilated by the blast, with the only survivors being the ones Satan was able to evacuate. Thank God that included Dan, because as solid as this scream is, I crack the fuck up whenever it gets cut off. Okay, jokes aside, this scene is actually incredibly shocking and memorable and just honestly legendary in terms of how hard it hits the game's tone from here on out. It was clear this starting village wouldn't survive past the first few hours of the game, but there was no reason to assume Faye himself would be so directly responsible. Whether he knew what he was doing or not, the villagers seem to have made up their minds by the time Faye wakes up, with no memory of what just happened. Dan acts as the spokesman for the village, lashing out at our protagonist while the rest of them alternately cower or join in, blaming the local artsy amnesiac for the deaths of nearly everyone they know. Satan suggests that Faye leave the village, and after seeing the destruction he's wrought, Faye agrees. He stares upon the imposing image of the black gear for what he hopes to be the last time, too bad it's on the cover, and then he heads out to the overworld, exiled from the only home he's known for the 3 years he can remember. Again, it's an unexpectedly dark take on popular RPG cliches. In fact, in another, far less interesting game, Dan would likely be the protagonist, though they'd probably draw him a little different. True to standard genre pacing, we get our first real dungeon here, and it's a forest, but instead of being the start of a grand adventure, Faye is completely and totally isolated, burdened with the guilt of what he's done, and without any real direction. Well, there is this cute little hobgob that shows you which way to jump to get further in the forest. I love these small dudes. The encounter rate remains obnoxiously high here, that's not going to change, but at the very least you'll still be getting a handle on the mechanics. There are some beetle guys with hard shells who more or less force you to use Faye's guided shot ability, a key blast type move that allows him to do ether damage. The number of encounters will likely also earn you Raijin, Faye's first death blow. Death blows are one of the game's signature mechanics, even if they end up being, again, a little basic on the mechanical front. Various attack sequences, all ending in a heavy, will trigger a special animation and launch a powerful move that typically cannot be dodged and deals far more damage than an entire combo string. And I really cannot begin to tell you how motherfucking sick these look. The animation and sound teams threw their entire dicks at these, and it shows. Each party member's death blows are satisfying, beautiful, and full of character. Unfortunately, the system has a few flaws. Learning death blows is tedious and involves repeatedly triggering the same attack animations, which typically requires an extremely slow form of grinding. And for the most part, death blows never accomplish anything more than dealing more damage than the previous one, meaning that, unless you're trying to unlock more death blows, there's barely ever a reason not to simply spam your most powerful moves. It's a system that, again, enhances the game's presentation immensely, but is left woefully underexplored. If the team had attached buffs, debuffs, or special states like enemy knockdowns and defensive stances, it would not only deepen the game's combat, but help individuate the entire cast. As is, it's only a benefit presentationally, but even then, I have to admit, I am enamored with how these things look. Faye fumbles his way through some more jumping, and we'll touch on the platforming later, when he's approached by a woman aiming a gun at him and speaking, well, I don't know what language she's speaking here, but clearly neither does the actress. The redhead in the military uniform refers to Faye as a surface dweller, or lamb, and says she's been instructed to kill any she runs into. She demands Faye tell her the way out of the forest, but he only asks her to hurry up and shoot him. Faye's character portrait actually changes here, unfortunately rare occurrence in the game, but one that highlights just how defeated he is in this moment. He quickly becomes even more desperate and despondent, demanding the woman kill him right then and there, throwing her off and causing her to hit him with a "you're weird," before a big purple jacked-as-hell elf man drops in from the ceiling and fucking decks her in the face. Oh my god! Our number one kung fu man springs into action to defend her, crying out the name Ellie despite never having met her before. She wakes up at a campfire set by Faye, who seems to have already imprinted on her in some way. His attitude is almost childish here. He seems a little miffed that she hasn't thanked him for treating her wounds, but he also insists that she only shoot him after he's led her safely out of the forest. On the other hand, Ellie, which turns out to actually be her name, seems put off but thankful she doesn't have to go through with shooting this man, something she was already hesitating to do. She's still obviously uncomfortable just being in the presence of a lamb, but the two can at least agree to a truce until they can escape the forest together. That night, Faye dreams of even more FMV anime. More cryptic imagery this time, as a young Faye watches a procession of identical figures leave him behind in a desert, alone.
You must be lonely here by yourself. Faye. Faye. Faye.
Another great cut as he's woken up by Ellie, who now eerily resembles the woman from his dream. And we're back up, following new helpful hobs and finding treasure, but now accompanied by our first new party member. Ellie's on the frail side, but her ether abilities make her the party's de facto black mage, able to dish out ether damage in all 4 elemental varieties. The game highlights her usefulness by throwing in some birds that perch high on trees before swooping down to strike, both making good use of the dynamic camera and rewarding you for using her spells. She takes a moment to question why Faye is stranded in the woods in the first place, and he summarizes the game's first chapter, breaking down into self-flagellation yet again. As if in response to his breakdown, Ellie flashes back to piloting a gear, taking enemy fire and being forced to make an emergency landing where else but Lahan. As if he knows what she's thinking, Faye lashes out, blaming the soldiers for ever coming to the village in the first place. In a moment, the translation unfortunately presents as Faye screaming, them, and hitting a tree like it forgot his non-binary friend's pronouns. Ellie snaps. Faye escalated the situation in the first place, making the decision to pilot a gear without training instead of helping the villagers evacuate. She says he's a coward for trying to shift the responsibility off himself. And he agrees, before collapsing, the trauma unbearable. The only things that penetrated the gear's barrier were screams. Screams accompanied by the stench of blood, the sound of crushing bones, and my own curses. Faye lashes out one last time before again breaking down. Ellie approaches before backing off, not knowing what to say. She stops again for a moment, looking back briefly before walking away. Again isolated, she slips into an FMV flashback of her own.
You talk as if it's not your responsibility.
No, I didn't do anything.
One which intercuts her chastising of Faye with scenes of her in a hallway, surrounded by bloody corpses. The editing weaves these two disparate scenes into an interrogation of herself.
You're a coward!
That's right. I'm a coward.
Ellie and Faye are both clearly, deeply hurt. Yeah, that's a fucking amazing and jarring and goofy transition, and now Faye has to fight a T-Rex, but nothing he tries seems to have any effect. Luckily, Satan seems to have gotten the land crab working, and it flies! Not much of a land crab. Anyways, he drops off the mysterious black gear, and despite Faye's protests, it truly looks like he has no other choice but to get back in the fucking robot. Faye does ask the doctor to shoot him if it ever looks like he's going to go out of control again, but Satan just kind of says, yeah, sure, hope that doesn't happen, and then pieces. Thankfully, it doesn't come to that, and Faye defeats the Rancor dragon with a triumphant, anticlimactic yelp. The gear, as it turns out, is called Veltal, and Satan brought it along because he thinks Faye will need its strength to defend himself. Naturally, Faye wants nothing to do with gears, period, much less this one, but everyone is very worn out and they all agree to make camp at Satan's suggestion. That night, the doctor takes a break from repairing Veltal to talk to Ellie while Faye sleeps. Satan again shows just how knowledgeable he is by accusing Ellie of crash landing in the village in her own language. He knows she's with the military and determines it would be best for both her and Faye if she leaves before he wakes up. Ellie hesitates and expresses regret for calling Faye a coward, saying she was just trying to shift the blame from herself. Satan is surprised that one of Ellie's people would feel such concern for a surface dweller, and Ellie recounts some form of propaganda she's been exposed to. She belongs to a group known as the Able, a people she'd been told were granted the right to shepherd the lives, deaths, and destinies of the surface-dwelling lambs. Ellie never thought of them as bad people. Her father was even sympathetic to them. Hell, her nanny was a surface dweller. How could she possibly have a problem with them?
I want that one, Daddy. Buy him.
But after witnessing Faye's strength and selflessness, and realizing they share the same pain, all she can do is leave, questioning everything she's been taught up to this point. Yeah, the class disparity theme is going to become way more prevalent throughout the main game, but Ellie's introduction establishes it really well here, along with the fact that Ellie might be a terrible fit for the military. With nowhere else to go, though, she's headed right back there, long gone by the time Faye gets up in the morning. It turns out he was awake for at least Ellie's confession, but still blames himself for the disaster in the village. Satan futilely absolves him before suggesting the two go to the nearby desert town of Yggdrasil to acquire repair parts for the Veltal. And so it's off to the desert, now with Satan along in the party. You can fight some Tusken Raiders with his cool little finger point move. Satan ends up being one of, if not the best party member by far. He's fast, hits hard, has high HP, and has plenty of utility with his arcane abilities. He can heal and buff individuals, and even has the Renki spell, which lets his next spell affect the entire party. His most interesting set of spells can grant immunity to a specific element and a weakness to its opposite. He has one of these for each element. It's great for shielding your party from enemy AoEs, but you can also use it on enemies to give them an exploitable elemental weakness. It's a really fun strategy. There's barely ever a reason not to use Satan, which goes some way to make up for his general shadiness. After a short sojourn through the desert, you arrive in the town of Yggdrasil. The soundtrack continues to go off as we enter a small but bustling town, giving the player a chance to explore and ask around for parts to repair Veltal with. The entire town is focused around the excavation and repair of gears, and most of the NPCs here make a living scavenging for old tech and selling them to the Ethos, who ultimately determine which country gets what. You can even treat yourself to this beautiful pre-rendered background of a gear being excavated. Satan is clearly proud of himself for this pun. The town is great for atmosphere, but there isn't much out of the ordinary here, aside from an angry drunk at the bar named Big Joe with an unreasonable level of drip.
I'm too legit to quit it. I'm too legit to quit it. I'm too legit to quit it. I'm too legit to.
Faye and Satan eventually drop by the Ethos Workshop, another gorgeous little diorama where you can watch them work on this gear's arm while the party learns that getting replacement parts for a high-end military machine might be tougher than they thought. Satan catches wind of some military action nearby out in the desert and rents a buggy so he can head out on his own and scavenge the necessary parts from the wreckage, telling Faye to stay put. Immediately after, the shopkeep warns Faye of sand pirates and says it was dangerous to let Satan go out on his own, causing Faye to take off into the desert after his friend. You're expected to just kinda wander around the desert without any visible landmarks until you hit a trigger point and enter a desert set piece. It's a little unfair. Once you're there, it's easy to become lost amidst the dunes and frequent run-ins with sandmen and sand sharks. Faye watches some not Zaku's hopping around, he sees a flying saucer, and steals a bike from an Aveh soldier he runs into before finding himself accosted by 2 more grunt units. Thankfully, Satan's here in a repaired Veltal to rescue Faye, and by rescue I mean tell Faye to climb in because he's the better pilot. Satan may have a point, as Faye easily dispatches the 2 gears, only to hear laughter coming from nearby. The gear is easily recognized as the one which gave the order to kill Timothy, sending Faye into another FMV anime crisis. As an incredible villain theme crescendos in, this FF12 judge-looking man introduces himself as Groff, Seeker of Power. He claims he used the village as a catalyst to awaken Faye, stating plainly that he plans to use him to fulfill his destiny of, as he puts it, destroying God. When our hero cries out, enraged at these claims, Groff responds that Faye resembles his father, causing our protagonist to let out one of the game's most infamous lines. "My father? You mean my dad?" This is probably the best time to have a conversation about the game's translation, which is actually pretty good. No, really, for the most part, the localization here is solid. Dialogue has a solid sense of characterization and subtext, people typically speak in sentences that resemble actual human communication, and there's an unreasonable amount of rad-sounding technobabble throughout. There are plenty of typos or awkwardly translated lines that can be pointed out throughout the game, but I feel bad doing that considering the entire game was translated by one man. Richard Honeywood was faced with a game where you indeed do eventually fight a powerful being that could be considered some sort of god, and I shit you not, was originally going to be named Yahweh by the Japanese dev team. Every other translator reportedly walked off of or outright refused to join the project. This man was single-handedly burdened with translating a massive JRPG full of highly technical terms, some of which are entirely fictional or theoretical, and names taken from everything from Sumerian mythology to early 1900s psychology to Christian apocrypha. It was a Herculean undertaking for any team, much less an individual, and focusing too much on the brief moments like these does a disservice to just how solid the rest of the translation ultimately is. Plenty of teams have done a lot worse with a lot more, and Richard Honeywood is solely responsible for this game even being released in English in the first place. But also this line is pretty funny, yeah. Groff summons a big worm and then dips, leaving Faye to fend it off in Veltal. It's kinda an unsatisfying conclusion to a really tense and promising scene, but it resolves itself nicely as the emergency repairs made to Veltal are worn out. Faye is left nigh catatonic from his encounter with Groff, and the party is surrounded by Aveh gears. Satan and the comatose Faye are abducted and placed in a cell on some sort of sand cruiser, now carrying Veltal, as Faye has yet another round of anime nightmares. It's a rainy night, and Faye watches 3 figures with Nen auras face each other down. One is Groff, saying something about joining together, seemingly in reference to a strange red-haired man. The third figure, based on his hair and clothes alone, is obviously Faye's father, and he makes it clear he's ready to fight to protect... well, that much is unclear. But Faye wakes up before we can get any more answers, while Satan flashes back to a striking scene, speaking to a strange, masked figure on a throne, surrounded by a fascinating, abstract background. The ship transporting them, however, gets spotted by a nearby sand cruiser, piloted by a young blonde man with an eye patch. The pirates torpedo the ship carrying Veltal, giving Faye and Satan the chance to escape amidst this quicksand chaos. The escape sequence ends with yet another flex of the camera system, as Faye tightrope walks across a crane in order to get back into his Gears cockpit. The party manages to escape their sinking ship, when they're accosted by none other than Shar Aznable and his custom Zaku 2S. He dukes it out with Faye until their battle causes both Gears to fall through some quicksand and into an underground cavern, where it soon becomes apparent that Faye is not a member of the Aveh military. The sand pirate apologizes and introduces himself as Bart, and despite the rocky start to their relationship, the two are able to call a truce until they can find their way back to the surface. Meanwhile, on the surface, this poor nurse laments the lack of any severely dismembered patients to treat, while Sigurd, the ship's first mate, seems to be familiar with Satan, even calling him by a different name, Hyuga. Before we can get any answers, we're placed back in the underground caves, the game's first mech-based dungeon, which means it's about time we talk gear combat.
What about the problem with those mobile suits?
As I mentioned earlier, this plays mostly the same as the on-foot combat, with the added wrinkle of a fuel gauge. Gears can still use light, medium, and heavy attacks with appropriately scaling damage and accuracy, only now they can't be strung together and they use differing amounts of fuel. Defending is replaced with a charge that earns you back a little juice, and all gears can turn on a booster to constantly drain their fuel in exchange for essentially giving themselves a haste buff. Attacking for successive turns builds up the gear's attack level, from 0 up to potentially 3. As a character learns death blows, they also learn corresponding gear death blows, which require successively higher attack levels and revert the machine back to 0 after use. Essentially, the combat mostly boils down to fuel conservation across the entirety of a dungeon. The focus is less on making the right move in any given moment, but instead on being economical with your damage output across many, many encounters. You can build up your attack level on a few weak enemies so that you can one-shot a powerful opponent with a death blow. You can throw caution to the wind and turn on the booster for boss fights when you can safely assume you'll get an opportunity to refuel after the battle. There's some strategy to it, but it's not particularly deep. Characters retain access to most of their spells too, and a lot of them even get upgraded visuals. Faye's guided shot turns into a full-on Kamehameha, or more accurately, G Gundam Sekiha Tekkyoken. And Bart can still use his Wild Smile ability, which debuffs an enemy's accuracy and evasion, complete with his cute camera damage status message. But healing is a non-option, both via items and magic, an added touch of realism that nonetheless lessens the amount of depth this combat system is capable of. The lack of accessible repairs makes these dungeons even more tedious. It encourages nothing but the safest place so that you don't take too much damage or use up too much fuel and screw yourself over for the rest of the experience. That's not to say that there aren't some cute encounters down here. These hordes of sandmen give you a fun power fantasy of crushing the dudes who are harassing you in the desert, and their tin robos trip and damage themselves when they try to attack you. There are also these creepy bugs who have taken over gears of their own, which are a memorable enemy design, and occasionally you'll be treated to an encounter with a nomad bot who will repair and refuel your gears for free if you can hold yourself back from bopping them. It's a really nice quality of life concession that Xenogears grants to players for the first few gear dungeons to ease them into the concept. Most of the issues I mentioned about tedium only start to raise their heads once the game stops throwing these guys in randomly.
Betrayal.
The constant encounters not only annoy me, but both of our party members, who start threatening to finish their fight right here and now. The two bicker back and forth until they discover a hovel built into a cave wall and decide to pay it a visit, meeting sour-faced Sven over here, also known as Old Man Balthazar. Old Man Bal's clearly been here a while, searching for fossils and pieces of ancient technology. He mentions that human fossils don't appear any further back than 10,000 years ago, which prompts him to start recalling a popular creation myth from the continent of Ignis. It's all very familiar to anyone who knows anything about basic Christian scripture. Humans once lived with God in paradise until eating a forbidden fruit and thus being cast out of their perfect utopia. The story diverges here, however, when the bitter and rejected humans build giants to challenge God, incurring his wrath even further and destroying their own civilization, but wounding him in the process. God retreated beneath the ocean, along with his paradise, to heal for eons. As his last act, God left new, righteous humans of his own creation upon the surface. Baal also tells the party about a way out of the caves and sells them parts and fuel, but the whole Garden of Eden thing seems a lot more relevant, and players certainly have time to chew on the thought while they travel around the cave, fixing sand sensors for what's probably way too long. This cave goes on for far more time than it should, but you're rewarded with some more juicy world building when you return to Baal. He hints to Bart at the existence of the legendary Omnigears, capable of great feats of power, but the real fun starts when he leaves to inspect the party's machines. Upon seeing Veltal, set to a starkly framed close-up, Balthazar recognizes it as the host for the spirit of the Slayer of God. Faye naturally has follow-up questions, to which Balthazar says, whoops, nope, never mind, don't worry about it, and we simply cut to Faye and Bart outside his shack without any answers. I love it. The dungeon continues to overstay its welcome. There's a brief but time-wasty section where you get out of your gears and ride a cable car to flip on a switch, and then just immediately ride the cable car all the way back. It's not just padding, it's completely unnecessary, and it really chafes my taint. Thankfully, that's more or less the end of the dungeon, aside from an obnoxiously tanky boss fight in the form of the Calamity Gear. Upon finally defeating the thing, it suddenly gets back up, forcing Faye to unleash a devastating combo out of nowhere. Even he doesn't seem to recognize what he just did, and certainly can't replicate the feat on command, but the path is clear for the party to finally make their way to the surface and be greeted by yet another beautiful pre-render. And before long, Faye and Bart are back on the Yggdrasil, the Sand Pirate's ship, complete with its own eye-patched first mate Sigurd and Nisan, the ship's Alfred-like butler. The ship will eventually be the party's home for much of the game, so there's a lot to run around and explore here. There's an impressive, intimidatingly large gear hanger that lets you view and get info on your mechs, like how Bart specifically requested one of his gear's eyes to be covered up with a fucking eye patch. There are some fun bits and pieces if you run around the ship. This dude in the sleeping quarters is crying over a novel, this one guy planted a tree when Bart was born and is trying to psychically will it into mirroring his growth. There are some smaller rooms, a sick bay, and an immaculate, gorgeous lounge that will provide the setting for countless future cutscenes. If you need items, Nisan is here, and so is the Neo Zeon insignia, apparently. There's also a nice engine room, wherein you learn that Bart and Sigurd lost their eyes together, in the same explosion. It's got a neat dog, too. The prime location is the bridge, however, where you can talk to this guy to check out some navigational charts, talk to Sigurd to launch the Yggdrasil, and, most importantly, talk to Franz.
Here she comes, my angel, my shining superstar.
Franz is a dolphin man and wants to show you some hot sounds he's recorded. It's just the game's sound test, randomized and contextualized in this fire-as-fuck proto-Napstablook mixtape. Out of all of the characters in this game, Franz is by far the most endearing, memorable, and merchandisable. I will defend him with my life, and yours if need be. Eventually, the Yggdrasil pulls into the Sand Pirate's secret base, where we learn that Bart's pretty beloved by the people he's leading. Talking to NPCs earlier made this pretty clear, but his interaction with these children really solidifies it, especially in this adorable moment where he gives them a piece of amber and the game plays the item get sound effect. There are some more spots to investigate, like Bart's room, complete with an enter and die note on the door, but it's unfortunately pretty bare of actual secrets. Nisan makes you a cup of tea in the cafeteria, at which point you learn why everyone has so much faith in Bart and calls him the young master. Turns out Bartholomew over here is next in line for the Fatima dynasty. In other words, our Shar clone is the rightful ruler of the Aveh kingdom. A usurper by the name of Shakan was said to have put him to death a dozen years ago, but in reality, the Sand Pirates rescued him and have been raising him to serve as their leader ever since. Unfortunately, Shakan still has one more bargaining chip in his back pocket, Bart's cousin Marguerite. She's a notable religious figurehead for the nearby country of Nisan, and supposedly holds one half of the legendary Fatima Jasper, which can reveal the royal family's most valuable treasure. The true identity and location of the Jasper are a mystery, but Bart is said to have the other half. We're taken to a situation room staffed exclusively by identical bald Baras with heart tattoos on their shoulders, in which Bart shows off some ancient scrolls that suggest the Fatima royal treasure might be one of those Omnigears Baal had spoken of. He puts forth a plan that's straightforward, if not daunting. Faye and Satan are being pursued by both the warring countries of Aveh and Kislev. Bart has a bone to pick with Aveh's rulership. If they can rescue Margie together, he can use the combined halves of the Fatima Jasper to obtain the treasure and reclaim the throne, ending the war. Citan is game, but Faye immediately balks at the suggestion, insulted by the idea that someone would be jealous of his power. From where Faye stands, all it's ever brought him is death. Hell, he's barely made heads or tails of his own situation, and he's already getting an entire succession plot dumped on him. He simply doesn't have the mental space to process this information right now, and so, much like Shinji, Faye runs away. Bart catches up with our hero and manages to ride the line between apologizing to and manipulating him. As the prince sees it, if he had Faye's skills, he could have ended this war already, and if someone had the opportunity to do so and didn't take it, wouldn't that be letting down the dead souls from Lahan? Bart doesn't beg and acknowledges that Faye has no obligation to help, but he makes his request pretty fucking explicit. Faye learns some ominous teases about the Veltal's hidden black box nature before Sigurd approaches to apologize on behalf of Bart. Well, he says he's going to apologize, but he just uses this opportunity to pick up where the prince left off on manipulating Faye, talking about how lonely and dedicated to the cause Bart is, and wouldn't it be great if you two were just friends and maybe considered helping each other out like it's not a big deal or anything, just maybe give it a little think, pal. Faye's simply not ready for this level of emotional labor. Overwhelmed by the new information and all that's being asked of him, our exhausted main character settles in for a restful, uneventful sleep. A stellar POV shot introduces us to a Gebler squadron in the midst of infiltrating Bart's hideout, surveying the gears in first person before launching their attack. The entire sleeping quarters is awoken by the destruction, and Faye races off to the docks only to learn that Bart and a few grunts are already deep in combat. They manage to take out one Gebler unit, while Citan gets a chance to jump into Heimdall, a gear of his own with a sweet teal and white color scheme and a rad set of yellow horns that remind me all too much of the classic Gundam V-Fin. The Gebler squadron itself is made up of fun, unique designs like the defensively built Aegis Knight or the twin range support Wand Knights. Unfortunately, there's not much of a difference in optimal strategies for fighting each one, but it's a memorable crew nonetheless. Once Citan wins his first gear battle, you even get a voice-acted victory quote, something extremely rare for this game.
That's it?
The down mechs keep getting back up though, leading Citan to realize that the enemy pilots are using Drive, a performance-enhancing drug, which I don't know how taking PCP would make my Ford Focus survive a head-on collision with a semi, but we're just gonna have to hand-wave our way past that. Bart and Citan fight side by side, but there simply aren't enough bodies around to deal with the entire Gebler squad, so when Pretty Boy Swag over here is about to murder some orphans with his gear, Faye is finally forced to make his big damned hero entrance. Finally, Veltal, Brigadier, and Heimdall team up as a trio to take down this Evangelion angel-looking drill mech that busted into the hideout in the first place. They even named it Spariel. The team really knew what they were referencing here.
Congratulations!
Eventually, this grindy fight mercifully ends, and Bart's shining example and ceaseless manipulation finally convince Faye to join the cause, though he says it's only till he finds his own path forward. Jokes about manipulation aside, this is all pretty effective. Faye's reluctance is 100% understandable, but his way of expressing it is, again, almost childish. Plenty of mecha protagonists have had to experience the revelation that sometimes, regardless of whether one wants to or not, one must fight to protect the things and people they care about. I've seen this situation executed so much worse so many times, but going around and talking to NPCs, learning just how many people believe in Bart and his cause, really sells it beautifully. Either way, with a party of 3, we're finally off to Aveh's capital of Bledavik to rescue Marguerite. You only get to explore a few parts of the city, but they're contextualized through one of these beautiful zoomed-out renders. The game takes even further advantage of this when you first enter, using the novel camera angle to pull attention to a Gebler airship hovering above the streets and docking at a military base. Aveh's unrightful ruler Shakan greets the commander, a man by the name of Kar Ramses, who pretty much ignores him in favor of yelling at this cross-faced general for failing to put down the pirates. The Gebler officer is then taken to visit Bart's kidnapped cousin in an attempt to uncover more information about the Fatima Jasper. Margie is still young and it shows. She's scared about her situation, but she can't stop herself from talking about how badly she misses Nisan. When Ramses treats her more nicely than anticipated, she even asks if he can get her some cake from her hometown. She remains compliant, but reiterates that she just wants to go home. Meanwhile, Shakan watches on a hidden camera, making plans of his own. And with that, we're in the streets of Bledavik. It's a charming town with charming music as you run through the charming bazaar, NPCs charmingly shouting at you about their charming subservience to consumerism. You can buy a bunch of mechanically useless but flavorful fantasy produce or sell off certain pieces of vendor trash for a better price. There's a little orphan boy who wants you to invest in his startup for a measly 1,000 gold. There's an old couple still stuck in their delusion that their son they haven't heard from in a decade will one day come back from the war, and there's a whole house of cats. You can watch some mechanics work on a Zaku in the gear shop and observe a fish tank when you have a nice meal at the restaurant. It's a chill spot. There's also a fun little festival square, complete with every carnival's prerequisite creepy goblin man, even if you can't go into the minigame tent now. There's a conspiracy theorist here who will give you a little creation myth involving the flying saucer you saw in the desert. He actually ends up being half on the money. You can buy a model kit and learn to breathe fire and then cool your throat down with a Bart Weiser light. Again, charming. This dad doesn't have any money to spare though, he's betting it all on tomorrow's martial arts tournament. That's right, we've got a tournament arc, baby! The 500th anniversary of Aveh's founding is tomorrow, and a festival is in full swing, and this gives Satan an idea. Faye's going to enter the tournament, complete with your choice of alias. We went with the beloved Slacker here, and will use his kung fu skills to keep all the guards entertained and off duty. Satan will act as Faye's hype man in the crowd, whipping the audience into a frenzy. Meanwhile, Bart will use this lapse in security to sneak into the palace and rescue Margie himself. While snooping around town, the party met an old man who hates Shakan's regime. After revealing Bart's identity to him, he informs the prince that the nearby sewer grate will lead right into the palace itself. After securing the key to the grate from some street urchins in a game of hide and seek, the plan is set. We meet a nun from Nisan who blesses us, we get a good night's sleep, and now we're ready to infiltrate the palace. I just want to gush about how cool this setup is real quick. It's a memorable set piece that makes good use of the two party members we've established most thus far. Unfortunately, we never even see Satan in the crowd, but Faye and Bart both managed to strut their respective stuffs with this next sequence. First up is Faye, arriving at the tournament grounds and chatting up the other combatants. This guy's psyching himself up, this guy can't stop pissing, Chi-Chi is here, and so is Big Joe, fresh from his stint drinking in Dazil.
All of my bitches legit. All of my calling legit. All of designer legit. Call with the plug and
He's even got an entire fan club in the audience, and lets Faye know that their love is the source of his strength. In the other tent, who should make an appearance but Dan? He swears revenge for the tragedy in Lahan while a mysterious masked man watches. Before the confrontation can go any further, the tournament begins, and we cut to Bart entering the city's sewers. The game will continue cutting back and forth between Faye's solo matches in the tournament and Bart's infiltration of the Citadel, which keeps the pacing snappy. Faye gets his round, and then Bart has as long as Faye's battle took to do his thing. Faye can actually lose a match and get knocked out of the tournament, leaving Bart to play Solid Snake in European Extreme Mode with far more guards hanging around. But for now, we'll just go through all of Faye's fights in succession before hopping over to the Bartman. Shakan gives a quick speech to kick off the festivities and invites Carr to stay, but he decides to dip. His second in command, however, a purple-haired woman by the name of Myong, decides to hang around and even catches an eye for our beloved Slacker as he enters his first match against Gonzalez. Okay, so Gonzalez counters death blows and he counters them hard, meaning the first round of the tournament is actually the most likely one to knock Faye out if players aren't careful. The next round is against Big Joe himself, complete with sassy finger wag.
I'm too legit to quit it.
It turns out he really does gain strength from his fans, as his flamboyant punches do a single damage each, but their cheers heal him on the spot. Attacking him will get you ratioed by his stands, which is the only real danger Faye's in during the match. Great and dynamic. Next up is Scud, who shows up with a really cute character design and then hits you with the
Percocet, Miley Percocet.
Scud's not really a threat, they're just here to kill time. The most dangerous thing they ever hit you with is a knife or...
No, not the beast! Not the beast!
Each of which does 1 damage. Their poison's pretty weak too, leaving them mostly spending their turns healing, debuffing Faye's attack, or buffing their own defense. It's one of the only fights where the game really encourages its combo system, which we might as well say a few words about now. If you don't use up all of your AP in an attack string, the excess gets stored. By selecting the combo option, you can use that stored energy to execute multiple different death blows on a single turn. Again, there's rarely a moment where this is more effective than just attacking every turn, but for an enemy like Scud, who can potentially heal more than you can deal with a single attack, this feels like the intended strategy. Like I said though, they're unlikely to beat you, just waste your time, which is actually to your benefit as it gives Bart way more time to work his way through the sewers. Up next comes the fated battle against Dan, who cries out in remembrance of the fallen people of Lahan as he strikes Faye. His attacks escalate from hapless flailing to a full-on tantrum to a legitimate reminder of the fact that at one point, Faye was this kid's sensei. Again, design aside, Dan could easily be the protagonist of another RPG, but if you simply defend and heal, Dan will eventually give up, furious that Faye won't fight back. He swears revenge, giving Faye Alice's wedding dress as a reminder of the havoc he's wrought. You can re-gift this to Ellie when she rejoins the party, and it's a decent piece of equipment for a few levels before it very quickly becomes obsolete in the face of later game gear. Alternately, you can shut Dan up real quick and give him what he deserves.
Alright, everybody, now here we go. It's a brand new version of the do-si-do. Just stomp your feet and clap your hands. Come on, everybody.
And with that, we're on to the tournament's final bout. The masked Wiseman stands there, not even striking Faye, but dodging every strike thrown at him, even death blows. Faye can hit him with a guided shot, but it only does 1 damage. The crowd boos and demands a real fight, but Wiseman's only interested in learning what Faye is fighting for. He knows his name, where he's from, even the fact that he's recovered from grievous wounds. If you haven't put 2 and 2 together yet, this masked mystery is the man who brought the injured Faye to the village 3 years ago. But before we can learn any more, he collapses, saying something about running out of time and fleeing. The confused referee awards Faye the victory, at which point Bart better have started making headway on his mission, so let's catch up with him. The first part of Bart's journey is a quick freestyle through the city's waterways. The current flows away from the palace and alternates its strength based on the opening and closing of a floodgate, so you need to mash the sprint button at various speeds to continue moving forward. Unfortunately, these tunnels contain plenty of dead ends, some of which have treasure to find, meaning Faye might get through 2 or 3 fights before Bart finally makes his way through this section. You can at least find 2 fun little secrets, one that lets you look out over the festival square, and one that lets you cameo in the restaurant's fish tank, which nets you some high-value vendor trash to boot. It's a little obnoxious, but if you beeline for the exit, it's not terrible. When you get to the exit, you meet a Fatima loyalist who's been camping out here this entire time, though he doesn't quite put 2 and 2 together even when Bart spells it out for him. And then it's into the palace. Guards will see you from across a room and they can sprint.
Run, boy, run.
But you can use a few breather rooms like the kitchen here to make your sneak safer by peeking out the doors, which, again, extremely impressive for the time. We really are playing Metal Gear here. When a guard inevitably catches up to Bart, he's got to fight it out, which is our first real chance to see him in action. Bart fights with a pair of whips, which leads to some fun animations and sound effects, but his design is a little scattershot. He's got decent HP, speed, and damage, but nothing spectacular, and his ether abilities are mostly nothing to speak of. Heaven Sent is a funny pun and has a neat animation, but usually does nothing in terms of damage. He eventually gets some buffs and debuffs, but they're mostly redundant with ones other party members have. His signature ability is Wild Smile, which significantly reduces an enemy's accuracy. It's a lot more effective than you'd think and gives him his only real niche, but at least it lets him be relatively self-sufficient as a fighter for this section. Spam that sand attack. You've earned it. Unfortunately, there isn't even any loot to find in this section, just more of the same. Run from the guards, occasionally get into a fight, beat them up, wait 3 full seconds for the menu to open so you can eat some hob jerky and heal after the battle. It's a fun diversion but overstays its welcome, especially if the tournament ends and you're given more guards to grind through. There is at least a library where you can learn the city's history from not Mei-Chen and even read some of the rewritten history books used by Shakan as propaganda. Finally, Bart reaches Margie's chambers, and she doesn't hesitate to come along with him, only running back to grab this cute little stuffed hamster thing. She even follows along like a regular old party member, and I'll take this moment to just praise her character design. The big teal bow balances out her color palette nicely, and I love the way the arms of her coat trail behind her as she runs. The escape is cut short, however, by Ramses and Myong, who Bart has some real fighting words for. Carr brandishes his sword, and we're in yet another boss fight. Bart flirts a little with Myong, who offers a truce. As long as Aveh is allied with Gebler, they don't care who's in charge. Bart won't take this offer, however, in another one of this game's rare voiced lines, and Margie refuses to run and hide anymore. And thus we have a weird sort of one-on-one battle with assists, as Bart can't target Myong and Carr likewise won't attack Margie. Instead, the two men simply trade blows back and forth while their respective waifu supports provide healing. Unfortunately, Carr is tough, his defenses are high, and he has combo strings of his own that deal pretty hefty damage. Myong's healing is far more effective than Margie's, and she can even cleanse the Gebler High Commander of debuffs, making Wild Smile useless. Ramses can go into a defensive stance as well, automatically dodging and countering any hit thrown at him for massive damage. You'd think this would be a great time to use the combo system, but building up AP for a combo requires at least throwing out a single light attack, which will trigger his counterattack anyways. Meanwhile, Margie's healing will sometimes outright fail, but if you manage to survive for long enough, Faye will enter to save the day with a Raijin, knocking down the boss and forcing him into a flashback. In the flashback, a mysterious red-headed man uses the very same death blow and several other familiar moves to take down entire Gears bare-handed. Carr flies into a rage and jumps right back into the fight, but with Faye standing beside Bart, the Gebler officer doesn't stand a chance. He's reached the limit of his strength and keeps getting distracted by flashbacks of the man in red, giving Margie the perfect opportunity to cast her ultimate spell and summon rats to flood the room. Under the cover of a rodent stampede, the party manages to escape down an elevator, fleeing from an ever-growing group of pursuing Gebler soldiers, where they run into who else but Ellie. She's shocked to see Faye again, but still does the party a solid by allowing them to hide in her room while the soldiers run past. Bart wants to know how Faye got on a first-name basis with the Gebler officer, but Ellie's far more concerned in confessing her part in the destruction of Lahan. Faye in turn confesses that he'd overheard as much between her and Satan, and all is forgiven. She then helps the party get to a gear they can escape in, but not before warning Faye that this is all she can do for them, and that the next time she runs into him, it'll be his enemies. And thus, our reunion with Ellie is cut short yet again as the crew launches to safety from a classic-style mecha anime catapult. Carr prepares to send his troops to pursue, but stops when he receives a message from a familiar, unfamiliar name. Back on the Yggdrasil, Margie tells us she'd gone out in an attempt to save fellow members of her sect, but by the time she had let herself be captured, many, including her mother and grandmother, had already been executed. You can go down to her room to comfort her, where she has a neat little penguin plush that I want for myself, but it turns out she's misplaced her pink hamster friend, who we actually get to name here. You can give her whatever moniker you want, but for the sake of the video, we're going with her canon name, which is Choo Choo. Before you can hunt her down, she enters the room and introduces herself? That's right, Choo Choo is alive, it's sentient, and she just declared her love for Faye. Everyone has a good laugh, and Margie thanks Faye for being Bart's friend before the ship sets off for the hidden route to the country of Nisan. Sigurd and Satan are chatting by the vending machines, where we learn that they both used to be members of an elite team of soldiers for Gebler, one that Ellie seems to be a part of now. They both seem familiar with Carr too, and are pretty distressed about his new command over Aveh. They're clearly knowledgeable beyond what they've let on to the others, and want to let them in on this info, but decided it'd be best to wait, even as Faye tries to listen in. But with a warm reception and a gorgeous pastoral town tune, we arrive in the holy city of Nisan. A peaceful place, and the populace vocally supports Bart in his struggle. It is, after all, the center of the anti-Shikhan movement, and you can even stop by a meeting of some sort of council plotting the country's next move. Since we fled Bledavik, the capital is under martial law, and yet there are reports of Shikhan's hold over the people weakening. The return of Margie has been a double-edged sword. The people are thankful to have their religious figurehead back, but now that Shikhan has lost his bargaining chip, there's nothing stopping him from sending his troops to raze the country to the ground. Things have already developed significantly, despite the fact that we just got here. The tone is hopeful but tense as Faye and co catch up with Margie in the cathedral. This building has some of the best interplay between camera and environmental design Xenogears has to offer. Beams of light through stained glass windows, towering Gothic architecture, the hum of a choir, the slow pans of the camera, the statues framed in the sun's golden glow. It's stunning. Margie reunites with her sisters and then guides the party around the cathedral, giving bits and pieces of lore as she goes. These angels towards the back of the church bear a single wing each. They must work together if they wish to ever fly and reach heaven. Margie takes them to the room of Mother Sophia, the religious leader who founded the nation of Nisan in the first place. Satan seems very eager and prods the party along to yet another incredible use of the camera and lighting. We get a gorgeous shot of a beautiful painting of Mother Sophia, who not only happens to look exactly like Ellie, but seems to be painted in Faye's style. As Faye is about to leave the room, he has a quick flashback of himself painting the picture, with the Ellie lookalike calling him Lahan before he's broken from his reverie. You can talk to the nuns about their duties and learn that the painting is from around 500 years ago, when the Mother Sophia sacrificed herself for the sake of the people, but all details about the event seem to have been lost to history.
Son, you know those MIDI files aren't sorted.
As you leave for the town, my son flags the party down into a house the city has given to them, and the gang meets up to discuss their next move. But before they can do that, Satan and Sigurd decide that it's finally time to explain why they know so much about the situation, and we can finally grasp a slightly bigger picture of the game's world.
Please ensure you have your copybook at hand, as you'll be asked to take down notes from the screen at various points throughout the program.
Okay, so there's this floating city out there called Solaris, and Gebler is merely their military arm. They use a dimensional barrier to render themselves unreachable, even if the surface dwellers were to develop airships of their own. Solarians, like Ellie, refer to these surface dwellers as lambs, and generally consider them to be inferior, good only for manual labor. Solaris regularly abducts lambs, brainwashes them, and puts them to work, though some can rise up the ranks, especially through the military. Sigurd was one such abductee. Bart has questions, and the game allows you to ask them in your own order. Sigurd and Satan met through the military, back when Satan went by the name Huga. There, they served under the very man who seems to have a vendetta against Faye, Karan Ramses. His name is actually likely a misromanization of Quran, as in the Muslim holy text, but I can understand why you'd change this for the translation, especially in the late 90s. Kar was another low-level citizen who experienced a meteoric rise through the ranks of the military. He believed in reforming Solaris into a true meritocracy, as opposed to its current birth-based caste system, and Sig and Huga both willingly joined his cause. However, it became clear that the end Ramses sought was simply another form of authoritarian control, and the two defected. There are some sweet panning shots of the town as we learn about Gebler's human experiments and the drugs that have resulted from them. Particular amongst them is Drive, the turbo PCP given to that Gebler squad who attacked Bart's hideout, which is regularly given to the soldiers sent to the surface. Faye worries about Ellie and the effects the drive could have on her, and Bart even saw some in her room. But this has been a lot of information for us and our party to take in, and Bart needs time to go and think. After we catch up and Satan gives him a few words of encouragement, it's time to strategize. Bart recalls his time as a child, playing fleet commander with toy boats, but now those fantasies have become far too real. The priority is to retake Bart's throne from Shakan while keeping Nisan safe. We get a fun tactical map with a breakdown of the opposing forces, and a strat quickly forms. A smaller unit will draw out the majority of Aveh and Gebler's forces while Bart and co. sneak into the castle. Satan's plan puts Nisan directly at risk, but they seem to think it's the best shot they have. He more or less volunteers Faye to spearhead the smaller force, and our tragic Kung Fu Man accepts, ready to do his part in Bart's fight. The next day, as Margie sees off the Yggdrasil, one of the nuns reminds her of the Nisan royal family's long-standing tradition of marrying the Mother Marguerite off to the King of Aveh. She and Bart are cousins, giving this a real Game of Thrones-y undertone, but she's generally too embarrassed to even address the suggestion. Meanwhile, Faye and his crew of gear pilots prepare to set off. Maitreya, the gang's leader, calls Faye son, to which he actually cracks a joke. "Don't call me son, 'cause you sure ain't my pops."
What a story.
He and Bart share a bromance, and a sweet FMV gives us a classic mecha anime catapult launch. That night, A red moon hangs overhead. Satan shares a heart-to-heart with Nisan before listening to some of Franz's hot sounds. Bart and Sig have a heart-to-heart of their own, and Bart hints at a desire to abdicate his throne to his first mate. Sigurd simply voices his support for his prince and future king, and the camera soars skyward to the moon before transitioning seamlessly to a room in Aveh, in which Kar and Myung seem to be sharing a bed. The Gebler commander suffers through a nightmare of Graf, looking on from above, framed by the same red moon, as the red-haired man from his earlier flashbacks tears through military mechs, both with his bare hands and in a mysterious winged gear. It looms above Ramses, ready to strike. He wakes up, sweating through his sprite-work titties, and steps out of the room. Myung addresses a hidden presence, which turns out to be Graf himself. He remarks that Faye resembles this strange masked villain, and he delivers a quick threat in response before bamfing out.
And I'm gonna make my teleporting noise.
The sun comes up as Franz detects some strange underground movement, but nonetheless gives the go-ahead to begin the assault on the capital. Meanwhile, the Gebler squad from earlier is meeting their new commander, and who else could it be but Ellie? They don't seem to totally respect her or her rank, but acknowledge that her new gear, Vierge, is only assigned to pilots with heightened mental capabilities. And finally, after all this build-up, after all this deliberately paced characterization and tension building, this beautifully strung-together sequence which sets our chess pieces in place, it's time for the plan to kick into action. Faye and his troops head into enemy territory via a solo mini-dungeon for Veltal. You can fight some of these flymech enemies or these goofy fuckers, and even get a chance to run into another repair bot or two. One even shows up at the end and offers to take care of you. If you don't immediately trust him, he attacks you, which isn't a threat, but mainly sucks because you don't get that refuel before what's going to be a really tough fight. It's an easy way to make this battle unwinnable, so I hope you don't save after killing this dude. Suddenly, Faye's troops are intercepted by Ellie and her squad in another beautiful display of camera technology, and our protagonist tells Maitreya and Co. to go ahead while he keeps the Gebler units at bay. The squadron's eager for revenge on Veltal, and Ellie reminds her troops that she hasn't given the order to attack yet, but it's too late. We're already locked into a solo fight through the Bishonen boys. Ellie feels responsible for her squadron and considers using the drive she's been provided, sending her into a brilliantly framed flashback to having the drug pushed on her in her early days in the military. The scene loops, and everything goes white as a faceless superior ensures her that her father's high standing won't spare her from this process. Another shot of Ellie in a spotlight, isolated, outside of herself, and only able to watch as she flees from a group of men in uniforms, becoming cornered. Over this, two unnamed individuals discuss the aftermath of the very scenario we are seeing here. Ellie is reassured that she is special, that she is talented, that this is a blessing, before crying out to the uniformed men and... We fade back in on Ellie in the cockpit, as she tells her men to step aside. Fully coked up and rocking a serious Oscar disgust face, Elaim Van Houten gives us Marita Cruz a decade and a half early. They're called aerods here, but they're clearly bits/funnels from a ton of UC Gundam series, and combined with Vierge's magical girl staff and spellcasting capabilities, they make this an easy top-tier mech, both in design and effectiveness. Faye recognizes Ellie and pleads with her to snap out of it, but she spouts off some obvious Solarian propaganda, spurred further into violence by the drive. She revels in the suffering she causes Faye, driving him back until... Faye takes the opportunity to tackle Vierge with his own gear, as the real Ellie claws for control over herself. He tries to calm her down, but she again screams in agony before throwing him off and letting loose a massive wave of energy before collapsing. The two meet outside their cockpits and, again, find that they relate to each other more than they'd initially thought. Ellie balks for a second at the thought that the two could, in her words, lick each other's wounds, but Faye thinks it's not out of the question. He has people depending on him though, so after asking Ellie to leave the army, he departs to catch up with his cohorts. We cut back to Bart, Sigurd, and Satan infiltrating the palace through the same sewer entrance that the prince had used to rescue Margie. The old man who lives down here finally recognizes Bart and rejoices, but the celebrations are cut short when, immediately upon entering the palace grounds, the sneaky squad find themselves surrounded. Myung explains that Satan's feint was far too obvious and departs while Shakan prepares to finish the gang off, only for none other than Myson to show up in Satan's landcraft to save the day. He's ready to airlift the gang out of there, but not before taking one last laugh at... All seems lost, but Myson has a plan B. Shakan stands there, dumbfounded as the camera slowly zooms out. One of my favorite sequences within this game, period. Meanwhile, Faye leads the charge against the Gebler fleet, giving us a sweet bridge shot of General Facetat making poor tactical decisions. Vonderkraum hasn't adapted to gear combat and instead relies on large naval guns, another fun classic mecha trope. He ignores the advice of his underlings and instead allows the drive-by boys to directly approach his flagship, the Kefeinzel, planning on wiping them out with the main cannon. You get to control Veltal in real time as you bob and weave past Vanderkraum's mechs and battleships alike. There's machine gun fire that can damage you outside of combat, and running into gears on the map will trigger a fight with these guys who rock some Code Geass looking sand skates or these four-legged puppy tanks. It's a really cool diversion from the usual random encounters, makes me wish they'd relied on segments like these a little more. As Faye approaches, Vonderkraum grows more panicked and erratic, alienating himself from his entire crew by the time the Kefeinzel gun is finally destroyed. Even if you let this thing charge all the way up, it does, like, no fucking damage. This guy really wasn't shit. Mr. Fong Wong regroups with the other troops and celebrates a job well done. Okay, so Vonderkraum's not dead, and he's got the fucking Shamblo from Gundam Unicorn. Dora the Destroyer over here is ready to fuck shit up, and it's kind of a marvel that Vonderkraum didn't just lead with this thing. It's heavily armored to the point where Faye's backup can't even dent it. Worse yet, it has a propensity to pick up your allies and bash Veltal over the head with them, which does a fuck ton of damage. In fact, Vonderkraum and his Dora would probably wall most players if he focused on Faye instead of spreading the damage across the entire party. He's very tough. If you whack his PP enough, his defenses are lowered significantly, allowing your squad mates to actually damage him and hopefully winning you the fight. All is lost for Vonderkraum when a voice calls out to him. Do you want the power? Descending from the sky is none other than Graf, who promises strength and salvation to the wounded general.
Dost thou desire the power?
The power?
Yes, the power.
Power. The power. I want it. I want the power.
Repetitive dialogue aside, I fucking love this sequence where Graf calls upon some strange force before granting it unto our recently felled enemy. A brilliant flash of light, and we've cut back to Bart on the bridge of the Yggdrasil, their own piece suddenly cut short by torpedoes striking the ship. Carr has taken up pursuit in a battleship of his own. He hesitates at the thought of finishing them off, however, flashing back to his own past, when a young, eye-patchless Sigurd decided to leave the Gebler military. This perceived betrayal has clearly left an impact on Ramses, who tells the comms officer to contact the Yggdrasil's bridge and demand their surrender, even encouraging his own name to be dropped. Should they fail to comply, it'll be the entire unguarded country of Nisan that suffers as a result. Tension mounts as the now burning, damaged Yggdrasil grinds to a halt in the desert sands. Cut back to Faye and Co., who receive an emergency signal from Bart's crew, but have no time to respond before Vonderkraum strikes back, now teeming and turgid with
the power.
The power?
Maitreya tries to buy some time, but is immediately savaged by the Dora's claws. Faye locks up at the site, suffering a similar experience to the one he went through in Lahan, and everything goes white. The scene seamlessly transitions back to Bart and his Brigadier, physically steering the Yggdrasil via a sized-up old-school ship's wheel. The ship's been in the midst of emergency repairs while cruising away from Carr's forces. Bart decides that Nisan's doomed whether he surrenders or not, and prepares the crew for battle stations once again. The Yggdrasil picks up speed, and Gebler, in response, prepares to resume their attack, when a report comes in that several of their units on the perimeter have been taken out. Myung tells them to put this mysterious new threat on the screen, and... That's literally just the Xenogears. Okay, at this point there has to be some connective tissue between Xenogears and Gundam Unicorn because... Okay, that tracks, that's fair. More importantly, you might remember this as the gear piloted by the red-haired man from Cars Nightmares, and it is in the process of fucking up everybody's shit. He immediately recognizes it as the Demon of Elru and sets off, eager for revenge, with Myung staying behind to chuckle ominously to herself. The mysterious red gear hovers before the Yggdrasil, asking Bart if he's strong and preparing to Omae wa Shinderu his ass before they're cut off by Ramses in a sweet winged Hyakushiki and Myung in a sick white gear with some baller pauldrons. I love this thing so much and it's criminally underutilized. Ramses' gear brandishes a sword and prepares to charge the strange Crimson attacker. Carr wasn't a pushover, and up to this point, he's been our most notable antagonist, so it'll be interesting to see how—
That's a good hit! Paralyzed on the spot. Right from the start, the power difference is obvious. Oh, it still can't move.
Carr gets utterly dicked on, being dragged away by Myung as he protests that he can still fight like a bad Monty Python reference. The Not Xenonju's wings glow with an awesome teal light as it turns its attention to Bart. You get the opportunity to take a few swings at this guy before he hits you with the fucking damage limit, twice in a single turn. Brigandier collapses and Sigurd takes emergency action, launching the entire Yggdrasil itself at the mystery mech, burying it in the sands. A desperate move, but it seems to have paid off until... Even that wasn't enough to take this machine down. It rises skywards, lifting up the entire ship without even making contact, letting it collapse under its own weight in what I can only assume was a reference to this cut from End of Evangelion. The pilot of the once and future Xenonju scoffs before casually tossing the entire sand cruiser back at Brigandier. There's a panic on the bridge. The fate of Bart and his ship are left a mystery as Titan launches in an escape pod at Sigurd's urging. He comes upon the wreckage of Vonderkram's Dora and resolves to find Faye quickly, before all fades to black. We pan in to the sound of an organ, as a military official addresses the man playing it. We quickly learn that this is none other than the Kaiser of Kislev, the empire opposing Aveh in this endless war. The other man gives the Kaiser a status update on the border, where a massive explosion seems to have been caused by a mysterious black gear. The gear and its pilot have both been recovered, though the machine's capabilities seem to be beyond what their mechanics are capable of analyzing. This should all sound incredibly familiar to you by now, but before any details are confirmed, we're interrupted by the arrival of a mysterious masked woman in a cool floating orb ship thing. She claims to be a representative of Grof's, giving technology to Kislev for free. All she wants in return is the ability to witness what happens next, and for them to move their newly acquired prisoner to D-Block. And if you're still wondering who that prisoner might be, we get another one of these. The music box song from before. A young Faye and what seems to be his mother, playing outside on a peaceful day. Faye is standing seemingly outside himself, watching old grainy footage of what could be a long-lost memory, similar to how Ellie just experienced her own flashback. A spotlight on yet another child incarnation of Faye. One Faye, it's not clear who, asks where he even is before an ominous chord cuts through the silence, and Yet another child Faye tells Faye that he shouldn't be there. It cuts the lights. One by one. Faye wakes up in the aforementioned D Block, an area for detaining prisoners in Nortun, the capital city of Kislev. The nurse watching over him says he's been unconscious for 4 days, and I think now is a great time to catch our breaths for a second and mention that everything from the start of the operation to this moment has taken place in a little under 2 hours of in-game time. The game might have lagged a bit in the caves, but aside from that, its pacing has been fucking phenomenal thus far, and will continue to be one of the narrative's greatest strengths for a good long while. There's this really solid rhythm of discovering a new town and talking to all the NPCs, going on a shopping trip, receiving some new objective, exploring the world map a bit before getting into a dungeon or a set piece, finding a boss, and getting a cutscene or 4 with some solid revelations about the world or the characters. It's all standard JRPG fare, but executed flawlessly. The game does a beautiful job at endearing you to locations before threatening them or otherwise building up tension. All of the musings under the moon before the operation really provide a great example of this, and the breathless climax and introduction of the OP Red Gear makes for a brilliant payoff. By the time everything's resolved, our protagonist has somehow regained a fragment of his lost memories while gaining new amnesiac gaps to be filled in later, and is alone, abandoned, dealing with an entirely new situation and trapped in the capital of the opposing country in the war. It makes Xenogears incredibly rewarding as a binge playthrough, but also guarantees that if you pace it out, you will get something new and neat every night you boot up the game before bed. Anyways, a few other crims, as they refer to criminals, have shown up to accost Faye, threatening the nurse if he doesn't go along with their baptism ceremony. Faye's done letting other people suffer in his place, and agrees. Their leader, Suzarn, great name, Tomy note here, brings him back to the Champ, a Blanca lookalike named Rico Banderas. After a quick assessment of the new guy, Rico decides it's time to give Faye his baptism.
Believe me, drowning is the least of your worries!
It's a series of one-on-one battles to determine Faye's rank. He's just gotten out of his seeming coma, but it's time to get back to Jackie Channing. Faye gets a chance to save, heal, and equip before the peaceful organ hymns are finally broken up by the sounds of combat. Leonardo, Heinrich, and Vargas look just like the stinky forest elves from earlier, but Suzarn looks badass and actually packs a solid punch and can even sap your EP. Finally, you get a shot at the champ himself.
Oh, is that the best you can do?
Rico gets Faye in a hold, but he's had it and refuses to fight. Rico decides to finish things with a devastating combo, but something overtakes Faye and a mysterious force knocks him to the ground. We get an actual face-off between the two, but Rico starts pre-buffed and you're likely to be out of EP thanks to Suzarn's ability. I certainly wasn't able to win this fight, and Faye finally goes down for the count.
Oh, he's so Pringles. Where your curly mustache at?
These voice lines are very rare and always way too low in the mix. Luckily, the Rico fight was a bonus, and Faye still earns his A rank. He wakes up sore and sporting a fancy new collar, learning that it serves as a bomb which will detonate should he attempt to flee the city's D block. After a much-needed rest, Faye's free to roam around this section of the city. Most of the people in D block are fellow prisoners seeking their way up the battling ranks. This dude over here believes in himself, even if the game doesn't. The rest of the populace doesn't seem to be faring much better. There are even a few Imperial soldiers living down here in D block amidst the prisoners. There's a small church full of orphans who are ready to trauma dump on you at a moment's notice. It's a cool little industrial slum that feels distinctly Midgard-esque. After wandering around, you'll run into a funny little bespectacled capybara man named Hammer.
Look at this person.
I love this guy's design, but he immediately puts me off by insisting on calling Faye bro, bragging about his abilities as a gear supplier and information gatherer, and admitting to being very aware of the rumors surrounding this mysterious new D-block prisoner. He also seems to be the only salesman of items and accessories in the entire town, and while I get the sense that the game wants us to like him, he feels too immediately pushy and parasocial and overall sketchy.
I don't trust like that.
Shortly thereafter, Faye gets approached by yet another stranger, Rue Cohen from the Imperial Battling Committee. The city runs its own state-sanctioned gear battles, of which Rico is currently the champ. The committee sponsors various prisoners and gives them the chance to participate, and Faye has caught Miss Cohen's eye. He's immediately disinterested in any more gears or fighting and turns down the offer, despite Hammer trying to pile on the pressure and calling Faye bro every 2 sentences. Faye Faye tries to go to bed, but Hammer won't stop sliding into his DMs. The old doctor's apparently been relocated to A-Block, and Hammer is excited to meet her replacement for the explicit sake of gaining access to black market medicines. The two head on down to pay the doc a visit, who turns out to be none other than Satan.
Yeah, my ass is everywhere.
Yeah, Glasses McGee has been tracking down Veltal and has infiltrated Nortune in the process. The two catch each other up before Satan urges Faye to attempt an escape, prompting an examination of the bomb collar. Satan's pretty good with machines and feels confident enough. Let's let him try his hand at taking this thing up.
Give it a button, Dada.
He died. He's a dead now.
Faye doubles back on that decision real quick. Hammer finally volunteers some very pertinent information that he probably should have mentioned to Faye much earlier. The gear battling champion can receive a pardon from the Kaiser and be freed. Rico, for whatever reason, has held onto the title and refused to budge, enjoying his life of luxury despite still wearing the bomb collar. But if Faye wants out, dethroning the champ seems to be the quickest way. The way forward is decided, and Hammer sets off to sign Faye up. We cut to a mysterious orb floating in a dark void, covered in screens, some of which bear these strange, cybernetic yet aged faces. The faces on these screens all speak cryptically of someone we can quickly determine to be Faye. They connect him to some unspecified disaster 500 years ago and mention a whole fuck ton of proper nouns the player hasn't heard at this point, like animal relics, gatekeepers, a geisha key, a figure named Cain. Half of this is nonsense to anyone playing through the game for the first time, making this a perfect incarnation of the omniscient council of vagueness trope. They do, however, give one concrete piece of plot development, as they order Nortune to be razed to the ground. Whatever these guys are, they're obviously deeply entrenched within the control centers of Solaris, and they're ready to use that power to wipe our party off the map. We can catch back up with Hammer, who confirms that Faye is indeed cleared to enter the battling tournament. He's excited and admits that it's purely for the clout he'll gain from being the new champion's mechanic. Faye is cleared to head to D-Block's outskirts and enter the battling arena, which gives us another brilliant overhead shot of Nortune, complete with a rad, massive battleship at its center like the SDF Macross. Faye shows up at the arena, and it turns out that Rue and the committee have provided him with Veltal for his fights. They probably just want to collect data on this mysterious gear, but this is still to Faye's benefit. After all, we're used to piloting Veltal, so these battles should go perfectly smoothly. Okay, maybe we have to do a little bit of relearning here. For whatever reason, these gear battles handle completely differently from literally everything else in the game. I cannot imagine how much of the game's dev resources went into this. You can set the turn-based stuff aside for a second, we now have real-time combat that runs way too fast. Fuel has been removed as a mechanic entirely in exchange for an engine gauge that can overheat if the player makes unwise use of their special options. There's a universal key blast mechanic and a universal dash that both generate heat but also speed up the combat to nigh incomprehensible levels. Every mech has ridiculous ups, water has an entire mechanical effect, and there are two separate attack buttons that allow for multiple different attack strings for each individual gear, and just... why? This is so much effort from Square, and it is really cool when you first encounter it. Like, don't get me wrong, it controls like ass, but there's an impressive amount of content here that'll only get more so when we get to revisit this area later on. It's certainly a cool and welcome change of pace, but... well, let's just put a pin in this for now. First things first, Faye has a few bouts to get through. About time! I don't know who's supposed to be cracking these jokes here, but I hate them. First up is Ganador, which is a pretty sweet Warhammer 40k looking mech with a physical sword and shield. He puts up a decent fight, but suddenly pulls away, claiming it's time to get serious. Explosives secretly planted on Veltal go off, critically damaging the machine, and Faye loses the bout. That night, its pilot, Leonardo, though for the gear battle they forgot the O, meets up with one of Rico's other underlings in the sewers as they brag about sabotaging Faye. The team behind Xenogears yet again takes advantage of the omnidirectional camera as the screen is bathed in red, and, for a few seconds, the game turns into a slasher movie as a monster slaughters these two in first person. Faye wakes up, having taken a day to recover, and despite Satan's warnings, he's ready to battle again, for real, and get this collar off himself as soon as possible. Now it's time for us to get serious, so we might as well upgrade Veltal, which, unfortunately, means talking to Hammer. Throughout the game, you can upgrade your gear's stats via their engine and their frame. The engine's output determines its attack power, whereas its capacity determines how much fuel you have to play around with. It's a fun, simple bit of customization that stacks across your whole party. Likewise, your frame determines your HP. Armor is usually a straight upgrade, but eventually players have to start deciding between raw defense and mixing in resistance to other damage types. The game automatically resells whatever part you replace for about half its original cost, which is just convenient. Gear equipment is pretty basic. Much like characters' on-foot equipment, you simply have 3 slots to fill as you choose. This can mean stacking on a ton of extra armor, or popping on terrain-specific boosting items like an O2 cylinder for underwater missions. There's an item that increases response values called magnetic coating, which is a clear reference to the upgrade Amuro gets to the RX-78 halfway through the first Gundam series. A few gears have swappable weapons, but they're rare, and beyond that, there's nothing much to speak about gear customization so far. Anytime you finish shopping for gear parts, Hammer tries to sell you on-foot items, and vice versa, making it really easy to get stuck in a vicious cycle of capitalism until you tell him enough already. Thankfully, these upgrades don't change your performance in the arena at all from what I can tell, making them entirely irrelevant to this section of the video. Again, pacing. Anyways, with our gear kitted up, it's time to prove ourselves in the arena. Ganador's been disqualified, both due to the cheating and because its pilot is missing, which means we have to move on to the second bout against Tin Robo. Okay, Tin Robo goes down pretty easily. I like that we get these victory replays. Again, they put a lot of effort into this game mode. Don't know how this guy made it to round 2, though. Up next is Titan, who reminds me of the Death Army soldiers from G Gundam. I'm sorry, fuckos, if it's not clear already, I'm going to have to name every mecha reference I recognize as I go through this thing. I am compelled to. The game splits the tournament bouts over multiple days, but nothing actually changes between those days. You just run back and forth from your rank A bed through a few loading zones. I understand them wanting you to feel like time is passing, but it just ends up feeling unnecessary and time-wasty instead. Up next is W. Shaver. You can just get a knockdown in OTG with these cheap little key blasts and it does most of the work for you on most of these fights. This thing plays like an even jankier Dragon Ball Budokai. Up next is Musha, one of the samurai-looking mass production units Kislev sent to Lahan, and it's worth pointing out the enemy AI is also pretty bad here. There's a block button, but they're really bad about using it when you're up in their face. By this point, your payouts from the fights have probably started getting pretty decent, and you go home for another night's rest. Oh, never mind. I guess something does happen between the days. There's a sewer system below the city that occasionally needs to be cleared out of mutants and monsters. Battlers tend to head down there for some easy cash, but several have gone missing lately. Faye's the newest thing in town and seems to be moving up the ranks pretty quickly. The repeated disappearances of his ostensible competition have only served to cast suspicion on him, and Rico's here to confront him about it. Faye, of course, protests and offers to come along with Rico into the sewers to prove his innocence. Rico seems to feel a little bad considering it was his subordinates who set the explosives on Veltal in the first place, so he agrees, and Satan tags along as well, giving us yet another new party of 3 as we head underneath Nortune for the game's next dungeon. Again, I can't say it enough, pacing. Okay, so maybe the sewers themselves aren't a great example of pacing, but the transitions into and out of them certainly are. As for the dungeon itself, there are a few moments of note, but it's also very confusingly laid out and guaranteed to test your patience. Encounters here are pretty basic. You have the return of hobgobs, these amphibious little boys that can inflict a weak poison, some armored insects, they all go down pretty easily. You can get a battle against the rotten sod, which fucking sucks. It's gross to look at, can inflict sleep on your party members, and counters death blows with an HP drain. There are also squads of bat rats which will confuse your party members, making for a really obnoxious and drawn-out fight. You can find a map of these sewers to theoretically help you navigate, but it's unclear which entrance leads to which exit. There are drains you have to jump over to avoid taking damage, there are little cleaning robots you have to hop over, we'll get back to the platforming later, but between the encounter rate, the encounters themselves, and the general cerebral hemorrhage that is navigating this space, the sewers just kinda fucking suck. star of the show here is Rico, but unfortunately he's pretty low tier in the grand scheme of things. He hits hard as hell, I like how his heavy attack is just a stupid huge punch, and his wrestling-themed death blows are really cool, from drop kicks to suplexes, but when you factor in his cripplingly low speed, his damage output over the course of a fight is actually pretty mediocre. His ether abilities have very little utility as well, they just let him buff his own physical stats, and worst of all, his HP isn't even that high. Rico looks cool, but he becomes difficult to justify picking as soon as you have access to anyone else.
It don't matter. None of this matters.
The sewers try to guide you around with locked doors, conversations about slime, and a mutant named Gramps, but yeah, the most rewarded you get for exploration is a few chests and this room full of pipes you have to platform your way up in order to get yet another piece of hidden equipment. We will get to the platforming later! But eventually, you finally reach the right patch of mysterious slime and can be attacked in glorious horror movie first person. The aptly named Red Rum is the boss of this area, and he's got a really sick design and a pretty tricky moveset. He can poison or confuse your party members, which the dungeon's already primed you for, but it may have not primed you for its murder move, in which it simply targets a party member and steals all their HP, healing itself and insta-killing them. He's also got a neat fire rain attack that hits everyone, including himself, but he absorbs fire, so this just heals him too. It's a pretty cool trick that Satan can guard against with his arcane abilities. It's a tough and well-designed fight, but if you keep at it, you'll eventually succeed, and Faye's name is finally cleared. Satan appears before the strange figure on the abstract void throne yet again. He's feeding this strange skull-faced man information on Faye, referring to an awakening that has happened several times by now. The figure, referred to as the Emperor, seems to be wary of Faye's capabilities, but Satan insists on leaving him be until they can determine whether he's a threat or not. Meanwhile, Ellie and her squadron of gear pilots are given an order to escort a battleship known as the Hecht in an upcoming assault on Nortune. She wants to know the objective, but is denied any further information, simply that this is a purge. She snaps at her soldiers before giving us a sweet new reaction image. And joins the Bishonen boys in questioning what they're even doing in the first place. Why do they need all these bombs, and what have the lambs done to merit this purge? Faye's innocence has been proven, but a Gebler attack is already forthcoming. We have no idea what Satan's up to, and we still have the gear battling tournament to look forward to. Despite a relatively stinky time in the sewers, the game continues moving forward at a breakneck pace. Before we can get any payoff on this, we have a few more rounds of gear battling to get through. First up is Hatamato, a neat-looking purpleman with a spear. We get to fight these guys for real later on. Firewheel's next. I actually really like this design. He rolls into a wheel while dashing, which looks sick. Silverstar is a chrome-plated version of the Hygog, but completely textureless, as if represented in the Super Nintendo fighting game Balls. And with him out of the way, we're set to take on the champ in the finals, and finally get this bomb collar off Faye's neck. That night, the gang checks up on Veltal for repairs and potential sabotage. There's some concern that the parts they have to work with just won't stand up to Rico's superior gear. As powerful as Veltal is, the champion is going to have access to far better maintenance, and Faye almost seems ready to give up, only to be interrupted by an onlooker. It's none other than Wiseman, the masked finalist from the Aveh tournament, and he decides to motivate Faye with a couple key blasts. Unlike the last time, we can actually hit Wiseman occasionally, even with a few of our death blows, but he also fights back this time, eventually finishing Faye off with a Raijin. Faye wants to know how this man knows all of his moves, but the masked mystery simply explains that Faye was fighting brute strength with brute strength, a tactic that will only lead to failure against a stronger opponent. To take down Rico, he must focus his energy on a single, decisive strike. Fugue State Thong Wong's priorities are in order though, fuck the championships. He wants to know exactly how Wiseman knows so much about him, and the strange sensei relents. Wiseman once studied martial arts alongside Kan Wong, Faye's father. Kan, not to be confused with Karan, aka Kar, the Gebler commander, and also not to be confused with Shakan, the usurper of the Aveh throne, was a military officer for some country before meeting a woman named Karen and deciding to settle down with her. Karen passed away shortly after childbirth, but Kan raised Faye himself, seeing great potential and power within him. Unfortunately, someone else sought that power and abducted Faye. Our protagonist already knows who it must have been: Groth. Wiseman and Kan joined forces and managed to rescue the young Faye, but he was very injured, leaving Wiseman to bring him to Lahan for recuperation, while Kan set off after Groth to ensure he could never terrorize anyone else again. Given that Faye's run into Groth several times since, and never his father, it appears as if the mission has failed, and Wiseman will now have to take his place. Before this walking exposition dump can leave, Faye asks what country his father was from, and Wiseman mentions a floating city, hiding behind a barrier. Not Solaris, however. It goes by a different name, Shavat. Dawn breaks on the day of the tournament's final bout. Rico's steer is an imposing Cherno Alpha-looking gear with some tank treads and a big-ass fuel reservoir on its back. It looks tough, but we need to remember Wiseman's words and wait for the chance to make one decisive move. Or you just Kusoge him to death. Like any proper grand finals, it's a best of 5, so you have plenty of time to download and dismantle this guy. And with that, Faye is the new battling champ, even if he's being humble about it. Rico apparently hurt his arm during the trip through the sewers, and Faye attributes his victory to a combination of that and getting lucky. Rico leaves his former henchman behind and says goodbye to Steer, while Hammer celebrates like he's the one who fucking won this thing. Back at Solaris, the Gebler forces prepare to assault Nortune. Ellie and her squad meet their commander for this mission, Dominia, a former lamb who caught Karan's eye. She seems eager to partake in this purge herself, having fully bought into the Solarian propaganda of her superiority over the surface dwellers. She will personally be piloting the Hecht to take out Kislev's generator, which should cause an explosion that will not only wipe out the city, but leave it and the surrounding area uninhabitable for centuries to come. She encourages her fellow shepherds to see how she handles the lambs before the entire fleet launches from a dock in Bledavik, and we cut back to Faye, uncollared, being granted the Champions Room. It sounds like Rico's gone missing after his gear reportedly went out of control and crashed into the Kaiser's box during another round of battles. Faye's granted the opportunity to visit A Block and even meet the Kaiser himself. Hammer goes to search for Veltal's current holding location with instructions to meet us at the Wildcat Bar in A Block once we're ready to proceed. First up, let's visit the Central District to meet the Kaiser. After we're led inside, a familiar face follows us in, climbing into an air duct.
What a thrill.
As champ, we have the full authority to move through the building as we please. We can meet various military officers looking at plans for a big-ass plane, this dude's taking care of a dog, and the soldiers are spreading rumors about the mysterious red gear that showed up in the desert.
Oh, me?
There's also this terrible minigame in which you move this crane around obstacles in order to use it as a stepping stone. We'll talk about platforming later. Use it to get behind these crates and you'll find a power magic. You can equip it to one of your gears to vastly increase its ether output. It's not useful for us right now, and earning it is fucking obnoxious. I hate this awful minigame. You reach Kaiser Siegmund, who takes a break from his Ganondorf organ to ask Faye to join forces with him. Before the conversation can proceed, Rico falls out of the vents with a full-on Wile E. Coyote eyeball awooga. Plans foiled, he runs away, distracting a few guards with his status as the former champ. The door they're guarding has a biosensor that should only let in the Kaiser and his family, but much to Rico's surprise, it lets him in as well. The smell of the room, triggering a flashback. A young child living with his mother in the city's slums. She's very sick, but can't bring herself to explain why there's no father around, only that he's a great man. But the child is a mutant. His nails are growing longer and his skin is changing color. He's clearly different from his peers. She collapses into a fit of coughing as an angry mob threatens them through the window. Rico realizes he's forgotten all of this until now. The last memory he has of his mother is of her telling him he'll be on his own from now on. He's broken from this reverie by Faye and Satan before being confronted by the Kaiser. Rico is arrested and taken away under suspicion for his attempt on Siegmund's life. We're told to take our time and consider the Kaiser's proposition, which means it's off to explore the A Block. But first, Hammer has located Veltal. There are two ways to get to its underground hangar, either via the battling arena or the supply train tunnel. It sounds like we'll need to get our hands on the train schedule, so we hop off this roof into a big tube, as you do, and end up in someone's bathroom. Luckily, we're the battling champ, so we can just do that and nobody can say shit. Plus, we know the resident. It's the former D-Block doctor who Satan usurped. She realizes that Satan is completely neglecting his duties now, which means that anyone who gets hurt or sick is shit out of luck, so she just dips to fill in for him, and Satan gets away with it thanks to the generosity of others yet again.
You're a fucking disaster, my guy.
A Block doesn't really look any nicer than D Block and is still covered in smog. The jukebox works, but doesn't even have a working disc to play. And there's a bar full of tiny cats and this child who claims to be from the Dragon Tribe who has a neat and unique design, but no other real surprises, just a whole bunch of people bummed over the war. If you go down this alleyway, you'll run into none other than Big Joe, who says he has something cool to show you for a measly 5,000 G. Head down the alley and he'll run away as soon as you realize it's a dead end. Once you've come to terms with being scammed, there's nothing left for you to do but head back to D Block and find a train schedule, and run into a few of Rico's old subordinates. They got news about their old boss and think he was used by the battling committee for that attempted assassination. The committee is primarily made up of members of the Ethos, that neutral religious organization who have been steadily getting cut off from their political power. Siegmund himself led a campaign of discrimination against mutants and demi-humans that got Rico chased out of town in the first place, so he's naturally got a bone to pick with the Kaiser, one that was easy for the committee to take advantage of. Now that he's been caught, he's left holding the buck and will be executed tonight. Faye decides that it's time to move up their plans and rescue their new friend, and yet again, a strategy is set. Faye and Satan hop onto the supply train, racing to the front as each respective car unlinks and is left behind. Eventually, they jump off into an underground supply tunnel, evading Kislev soldiers and duking it out with mechanics and various wildlife. It's obnoxiously samey and maze-like without much worth talking about. You can pick up a gear part that Satan will specifically note as being useful, a Frame HP 30. Frame HPs fill one of your gear's equipment slots and finally allow it the ability to repair itself in combat, in exchange for a high fuel expenditure. It really is as useful as Satan points out, and worth having on most if not all your gears for the rest of the game. You'll get a chance to equip it shortly thereafter as you emerge into the gear hangar. There's even an automated shop there that lets you tune up Veltal if it's not already fully kitted up, and then it's up to the surface to rescue Rico. The Kislev government seems to really have fun with their capital punishment. They just dump Rico into a desert and stick a Rancor dragon on him. This kicks the utter shit out of the electric chair. If the state's going to be brutal and inhumane on a level completely unthinkable in our modern world, you might as well make a spectacle out of it. Considering Faye used Veltal to save Ellie from one of these right at the start of the game, it's not the most imposing boss fight, and our big buff orc boy is finally rescued. Faye gets a little tsundere in justifying his actions, but Rico doesn't plan on leaving just yet. It seems like that decision might get made for him, though, as both warriors notice a rumbling in the air. And suddenly we're under attack. Spotlights illuminate the sky as the city attempts to take down Gebler's fleet with its anti-aircraft guns. Satan can already tell what Solaris is trying to achieve. If the lead ship reaches the reactor, this city will be wiped off the map. Faye jets off to change its course, only to be met by a familiar squadron of mini-bosses. While we work our way through them, one more time, Satan is on the ground, evacuating civilians just like in Lahan. Rico tells himself he doesn't care about any of these people, but Faye's words stick in his mind, and he soon finds himself hopping back into Styr to join the fray. He and Faye fight alongside each other ever so briefly before who should show up but Ellie in her Vierge. Faye pulls Ellie aside to beg her to leave the military, but she doesn't know where else she even belongs. Ellie assumes that there's nowhere else for her, prompting Faye to show her the destruction her allies are causing. He almost does the snap out of it woman slap, but thankfully holds himself back and instead just mansplains about how he has nowhere to belong himself right now. He has no idea where Bart and the others are, or if they're even alive. He doesn't know where he's going, or even what he's really doing. All Faye knows is that there are people in danger right now. People he has the power to help. Once again, our protagonist leaves Ellie behind so he can go out in Veltal and hopefully save the city. I'm just glad he didn't put on the John Lennon cosplay in the process. Faye and Rico meet up atop the ship bomb Hecht, which is like a gear centaur, only instead of a horse, there's an entire fucking cruiser. Dominia uses its air rods against the party while they wail away on her. Unfortunately, the camera angles are not kind to our Gears attack animations here. Styr has really good stats as far as gears go, but lacks any special options or abilities. With its help, you'll eventually force Dominia to eject. Ellie watches the city burn, distraught, while Faye and Rico have a Char's counterattack moment trying to divert the angle of the ship. Their output isn't enough, and all seems lost until Vierge joins in, successfully aiming the Hecht away from the reactor. Now it's heading towards the civilian area, though, and worse yet, Styr and Veltal have both overheated. Ellie remains, however, still giving it her all. Just a little more, and... Vierge falls, having done everything it could. Rico and Bart watch the craft descend onto the city, an explosion erupting forth from it. In the midst of the chaos, Grof's gear flies in, seemingly shielding Ellie from the blast before flying away. She blacks out for a moment, and when she comes to, Veltal is carrying her. Ellie asks the crying Fae for forgiveness, and he tells her there's nothing to apologize for. A lovely shot of the two gears together as they make their exit. The gang regroups and plans their next move. It's clear that the Kislev Empire won't be safe anymore, and they need a way out. Hammer mentions rumors of the Goliath air cruiser, and lo and behold, Ellie knows exactly where Kislev's been storing it. Hammer takes Ellie, of all people, aside and tells her about something that we never learn, and as far as I'm aware, never comes up again in-game. We'll talk about cut content later. Regardless, yet another plan is formed, and yet another objective is set. We're apparently wanted now, but Faye's also the ex-battling champ with a reputation to match. The guards definitely recognize him, but play it cool for the sake of not getting their asses kicked. That is, at least until the new guy blurts out that Faye's the guy from the wanted posters, and the reluctant guards are given no choice but to try and stop the party. Before we can tear through these obviously outmatched hourly employees, Rico shows up and does it himself. He says he has no intention of joining the party and still has something he wants to accomplish on his own, likely taking his revenge against his dad, but he wants to get out of the city until things calm down, saying he'll help them escape, and after that, they can just drop him off anywhere convenient. And with that, we can finally dip from Nortune, except there he is again! Big Joe doesn't do refunds and instead offers what he refers to as super muchacho information. This arcane lore is just that you can change party members by talking to a waitress in town, and Faye demands his money back again. Joe won't comply, but tells you he left something down that alleyway for you as an apology. Follow his advice, and this time there's a disc on the ground that you can use in the bar's jukebox to listen to some of those sweet, sweet game tunes. And with that, it's finally time to say goodbye to Nortune and travel north, up the world map to the secret Kislev gear hangar. This is one of the first times you get to traverse the overworld in your gears, which you can quickly hop in and out of via simultaneous press of the L2 and R2 buttons. I didn't know about this shortcut for my entire first playthrough. It saves a lot of time. I really wish the game was better at informing players about this. It's fun wrecking on-foot enemies with your overwhelming firepower. Gears even have a separate set of attack animations for smaller targets, and they're pretty funny.
Stomp 'em in the nuts. We'll stomp 'em in the nuts.
Once you get to the hangar, you're greeted by an eerie silence, and Hammer shows up in a hijacked repair gear, saying he's already opened all the locks. The Kislev military has some forces lying in wait to defend their new super weapon, like these purple spear dudes we fought in the tournament, and the fast and agile shinobi Mark Zeros, but we also finally have Ellie and her Vierge as permanent additions to the party. She makes good use of that power magic we picked up earlier and other ether-based equipment to blast enemies with elemental damage and AoE via her spells, which don't even cost fuel. She also has access to her air rods as a non-elemental screen wipe. It's costly, but since her death blows are only mediocre, it's the best use of her fuel. Occasionally, the dungeon will throw some on-foot mechanics into the mix to repair enemy gears mid-combat, but Ellie can wipe them all out in a single turn. It goes a long way towards cementing Vierge's place as one of the most useful gears to have in your party. After several hallways full of random encounters and set ambushes, we finally get a big, dorky-looking mobile weapon of a boss that goes down fairly easily, and the party boards the Goliath. It's just about ready to launch, and luckily Satan seems to be confident in his ability to pilot the thing. We watch the propellers whir to life as the massive craft picks up speed, the party members sitting impatiently before, with a brilliant burst of triumphant music, the ship takes flight, soaring majestically over the seas. But before the gang can even celebrate, Groth appears before the ship, hovering alongside his gear. Faye doesn't hesitate and heads atop the ship to confront him and Veltal, followed by Rico and Ellie in their respective gears. The cocky bastard is sandbagging us. He's not even piloting his own mech, but that doesn't stop him from taking out half of Veltal's HP with a single use of his own version of guided shot. He can face tank thousands of damage in direct strikes from the party's mechs, while being able to dish out just as much or more with his bare hands. All the while, his own gear stands to the side, arms crossed, Gynax posing on us like the alpha Chad he is. In order to save the party, Satan takes evasive maneuvers to throw Groff and his gear off the top of the plane, yelling at Hammer to take command of one of the ship's guns. The Capybara man panics, but eventually acts like a proper Shinji. Center on the target, pull the switch. He fires on Satan's countdown and seems to blast Groff's machine out of the sky.
Good shooting.
Hammer goes full gamer and brags about his mad skills and tells Satan it's okay if the others fell off the Goliath to the briny depths of the sea, as long as the dock still has him.
I just don't trust anybody like that.
This prompts a big smack from Rico as Ellie sits, contemplating why Groff never targeted her or her gear. The party can finally take a breather though. Or so they think. Observing the maiden flight of Kislev's brand new superweapon is none other than Prince Patchy the Pirate, riding aboard the now christened Yggdrasil 2, which doubles as a naval vessel. Sigurd and Myson are here too, and already trying to tell their prince to calm down for just a second. Bart's not going to let this chance pass by to take down Kislev's flying fortress and try out this ship's new weapon, which he's humbly named the Bart Missile. Just as Satan insists that the Goliath won't go down so easily, the projectile makes contact and this game's proper JRPG airship moment gets delayed for a good long while. The Doctor tells everyone else to eject as he begins guiding the ship's descent directly into the Yggdrasil 2. It's a really funny and unexpected moment of mistaken identities, but also, what the fuck was Satan doing? Based on his comments here, he knows Sigurd and Bart are on the ship. His kamikaze here causes a legitimately massive explosion and can only be read as ill intent.
It's a prank, man. Lighten up. It was funny. Pranks are hilarious. This guy doesn't like pranks.
We cut to Kar Ramses, who's being informed of something involving a gatekeeper. It seems to have something to do with the Kislev ship, but Groff teleports in out of nowhere and gives the lightest possible suggestion to pursue, which is all the prodding it takes for Ramses Ranch to decide to give chase. Myung and our Kung Fu Darth Vader have a private conversation of their own, one full of vague references to vessels and chosen ones. Despite Groff's repeated displays of physical prowess, Myung always seems to have the upper hand in these scenes, almost like he owes her something. The creepy TV orb shows back up again, discussing anima relics and some sort of M project. After shouting out the best Smash game, they reference a man named Krelian searching for Zeboim's legacy, which, whatever it may be, dates as far back as 4,000 years ago. Based on their vague musings combined with Myung's in the previous scene, it's also apparent that Kar and Faye have some sort of deeper, more direct connection, one from which Kar suffers a great deal of trauma. There's talk of neglect here, which the internet tells me is apparently a mistranslation of a direct romanization of neglect. Apparently, the original Japanese had them literally say nigorecto or something similar. I can't blame the translator for assuming this was just yet another proper noun in a sea of countless ones, or yet another reference of something he just wasn't familiar with. The skull-faced Emperor joins the group chat and has a nearly adversarial tone when addressing these crusty old computer dudes.
I hate these old men!
He talks about nanotechnology lost beneath the sea being kept a secret by the ethos and whatever an Anonelbe is. Overall, this is a really confusing scene that introduces a lot of pieces without letting you know what any of them mean, which is more or less what these sequences are supposed to do, so nailed it, I guess. They end the sequence on an appropriately ominous line.
Cain, we are gods.
Ellie wakes up atop a piece of wreckage on the open sea. Faye's been up for 2 days gathering what little food he can. Things are going much smoother for Satan, Rico, and Hammer, who have already been picked up by Bart and his crew, who seem to have already repaired the Yggdrasil. The doc takes Rico to the bridge to meet the man of the hour himself, Franz, and his sweet sounds. He introduces Rico to Bart too while he's at it. Rico's not too happy to learn that this is the man that shot down the Goliath, and tackles the bandit prince as we fade out like some kind of sitcom. Meanwhile, Ellie's trying to figure out how to get to the gears underneath all this wreckage while Faye attempts to catch a fish with his bare hands. He succeeds, but before he can figure out how to cook it, his attention is pulled skyward, to that same flying saucer we saw in the desert. Ellie recognizes this as Shavat, which Faye in turn recognizes as the name of the country his dad was from. It's a sort of rival state to Solaris and uses similar dimensional barrier technology. Nothing immediately relevant, but definitely something to keep in the back of your mind. Something the game has done a great job at occasionally reminding us of so far. We cut back and forth a bit more between the two groups. Hammer tries to demonstrate his value to Bart by informing him that Shakan is still in control of Aveh. I see your game, Hammer.
Clearly none of you have any idea how to run my system.
Bart meets up with Rico, who's gotten the rage out of his system, and finds that he actually really digs these digs, offering to join the crew. Bart tries apologizing to Satan, who doesn't much care in the first place, but he does drop a spicy piece of new information. The ship Bart and Co. discovered and co-opted as the Yggdrasil 2 doesn't appear to be constructed by Aveh, but instead by Shavat. Satan, as he does, hints at knowing even more than he's letting on about that, but moves the conversation along quickly.
This thread is no longer constructive and therefore has been locked. Thanks for your understanding.
A familiar music box tune plays over the scene of a dark and still sea. Faye and Ellie bond in the dead of night, staring at the stars. Faye worries that he's just helping people so he can feel needed, and not because he's a good person who legitimately wants to aid others. He apologizes to Ellie for getting her involved, but she pushes right past that and offers some comforting words. It's okay to not always feel whole. Sometimes, just a part is better than zero, and if you repeat that enough, one day, you'll eventually be whole too. The camera drifts to the two, perched on the edge of the wreckage, musing. Ellie flashes us back to a time she gave Faye some emergency rations, less out of survival and more out of her desire to do something nice for him. And he, in turn, forced down the dry and chalky rations because it clearly meant something for Ellie to give them to him in the first place. Even when the two think they're being selfish, they're still helping each other, and vice versa. The use of a flashback during this sequence really drives home how long they've been out here. This isn't some first night conversation. And yet, no matter how long it's been, stranded on this wreckage, it feels like they've known each other for so much longer. The next morning, a brassy and energetic song breaks the silence as Faye wakes up Ellie to witness a massive ship approaching. The large barge takes charge, extending a crane to scoop up the debris as Faye and Ellie are greeted by a friendly dolphin guy who eagerly welcomes the pair to Thames, the city at sea. The two are welcome to stop by the bridge and introduce themselves to the captain whenever they want, but for now, their gears are being excavated and repaired, and it's time to explore a brand new location. But first, the end of the video. Alright fuckos, for the sake of my own mental health, I'm going to be making and releasing this project in parts, and if you couldn't tell, this is the end of the road for part 1. The entire thing is written and footage has all been recorded, but editing and voiceover take time, and there's other stuff I want to work on in the meantime, so if you want to amuse yourself while waiting for part 2, I have plenty of other videos for you to indulge in. If you just happen to like my voice and vibe, you can catch me live on Twitch, and if you're particularly desperate to see how this game resolves itself, I do have a VODs channel where you can watch me play through the entire game, collecting the very footage I'm using for this video series. You can hear even more of my thoughts on the game, and watch me attempt to voice act the entire thing. Anyways, I've condensed down the first 24 hours or so of this game into a little over 2, but we still have 56 plus left, so it's back to the editing mines for me. I'll catch you next time, and again, thank you for watching.